On May 10, 1996, Mount Everest was hit by the deadliest storm ever, trapping people in what's known as the death zone. For nearly 30 years, there's been debate about what really happened and who or what is to blame for the tragedy that killed 8 people that day. This story isn't just about a bad storm, it's about people pushing limits while facing impossible odds and having to make tough decisions while their bodies are shutting down from the high altitude. Heroes arose on that day, and so did villains. But the big question is, was anyone to blame? Or was it a tragic consequence of climbing the world's tallest mountain? We'll dive into the heart of the storm. We're going to hear from those who lived through it and get first-hand accounts from survivors, the heroes, and those whose decisions have been scrutinized for almost 3 decades. So let's start right at the very basics. Where is Mount Everest? Well, it's situated on the border of Tibet and Nepal, nestled in the Himalayan mountain range. It's a staggering 8,849 meters, or 29,032 feet, and it's the highest point on Earth. Known as Chomolungma in Tibetan, which means Mother Goddess of the World, and Sagarmatha in Nepali translates to the head of the Earth touching the heaven. And Mount Everest is climbed mostly from the south side in Nepal and the north side in Tibet. The most famous indigenous groups living in the Himalayas are the Sherpa people. And the word Sherpa is often used to mean mountain guide, but it's actually an ethnic group that mostly resides in regions spanning Tibet, Nepal, and India. And Sherpas have tons of mountaineering experience, and without them, many Everest climbs would be impossible. The Sherpa people are genetically adapted to high altitudes, which results in their reputation as really great mountaineers. They also have physiological traits that give them advantages such as better blood circulation than most people. British mountaineer Kenton Cool, who holds the non-Sherpa summit record at 17, acknowledges the indispensable role of Sherpas. He said when it comes to climbing the mountain, Sherpas have this phenomenal energy and power on the mountain, and they're the backbone of any expedition. Their contributions extend beyond guiding. Sherpas carry the heavy loads, they construct camps, they secure routes through treacherous terrain, and they ensure the safety of climbers. They also tend to all the climbers at camp and do the cooking. And then there's Sherpas who climb at higher altitudes, and they're very highly specialized. These jobs are obviously more dangerous, requiring experienced Sherpas, and they get higher pay. But of course, Everest is a dangerous game. There's avalanches, the altitude sickness, exposure, frostbite, ice blocks falling on you, crevasses to fall into. It just really never ends. And 1/3 of the people who have died on Everest were Sherpas. But a Sherpa has great incentive to go on these mountaineering trips because they can earn about 10 times the average wage in Nepal. Kami Rita Sherpa holds the record for the most ascents of Everest. In 2023, he climbed it for the 28th time, at 53 years old. We're going to dive into the early expeditions here because they're really significant in the history of Everest, and they're very tied in to how commercial expeditions rolled out later on. The first British expedition was in 1921, and it was kind of a reconnaissance trip, mostly for mapping and to see if a route to the summit could be found from the north side. George Mallory, Guy Bullock, and Edward Wheeler spent 5 months of arduous climbing around the base of the mountain. They reached the North Col at 7,000 meters, or 23,000 feet, before being forced back by strong winds. And if you're wondering, a col is the lowest point of a ridge or saddle between 2 peaks. They didn't get to the summit, but it was then that they knew that it was possible. This was very exciting at the time. In 1922, the second British expedition headed out, and it also had Mallory on the trip again, and you'll hear about him a little bit later. They made several attempts on the north route, and they climbed to 8,170 meters, or 26,800 feet, before retreating. But it was significant. They were the first humans to climb above 8,000 meters, or 26,246 feet. And we'll do a little sidebar here on 8,000 meter peaks. There's only 14 mountains on Earth that are over 8,000 meters. And any altitude over 8,000 meters is referred to as the death zone. Why is it called that? So the death zone is the altitude above a certain point where the pressure of oxygen is insufficient to sustain human life for an extended time period. Above 8,000 meters, the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere falls 40%, making it difficult for the body to get the oxygen that it needs. Some climbers have compared the experience to running on a treadmill and breathing through a straw. In the death zone and higher, no human body can acclimatize. The body uses up its store of oxygen faster than it can be replenished. An extended stay in the death zone without supplementary oxygen will result in the body deteriorating, loss of consciousness, and ultimately death. So that's why you see climbers strapping the oxygen tanks onto their backs as they're climbing Everest so they can breathe that supplemental oxygen. But a problem with that is they only have so much time on that oxygen, and if they take longer getting up to the summit and back down, they risk running out of oxygen if they're slow. And keep that in mind because being slow and delays are a really important part of this discussion later on. So back to the expeditions. A day after that first attempt, Australian mountaineer George Finch, described as one of the best alpinists of the time, attempted to climb Everest with his cousin, Jeffrey. Poor Jeffrey had zero mountaineering experience, but, he must have liked his cousin because he went along with him despite that. They climbed up to the North Ridge at 8,320 meters, or 27,300 feet, using oxygen for the first time. And this was significant because they were the first climbers to sleep using oxygen that high. But they didn't make it in the end. The third British expedition was in 1924 with Brigadier General Charles Bruce and George Mallory, with newcomers Noel Adele and Andrew Irvine. On June 2nd, they set off from the North Col to make the first summit attempt. But with extreme wind and cold, exhaustion, and the refusal of the Sherpas to carry gear farther, that led them to abandon their attempt. On June 8th, Mallory and Irvine left their high camp to attempt the summit. Odell was climbing below, and he saw the two on this ridge up ahead, way up above, nearing the base of the final pyramid. They were climbing what he thought was the very difficult second step. But it was the last time Mallory and Irvine were ever seen alive. And in 1999, Conrad Anker of the Mallory and Irvine Research Expedition found Mallory's body. And they still haven't found Irvine's body. And there's opposing views on this in the mountaineering community today as to whether the pair actually reached the summit or not. But as Ed Viesters said, it doesn't really matter if you make the summit, because if you don't make it down, it doesn't count.
Getting to the summit is optional. Getting down is mandatory. It has to be a round trip.
There's another attempt in 1934 by Maurice Wilson, a British eccentric. He had zero climbing experience, and his intention was to summit Everest by himself, which totally makes sense. And he wasn't a pilot, but he took a few flying lessons, so he flew himself there illegally from Britain. And like I said, Wilson wasn't a climber, so the tradition of going to Everest with barely any skills started way before the mountain was ever conquered, and continues to today. And he expected to make it to the summit with spiritual help. So that would make up for, I guess, the lack of climbing skills. But it's not believed that he ever summited. His body and his diary were found in a tent the next year. And there were many other attempts over the following years, but none of which were successful. And then in 1950, Nepal opened its borders to foreigners, and this was a new way into Everest. All previous expeditions started from Tibet. In 1951, a British expedition with Edmund Hillary traveled to Nepal to survey a new route via the south face. They concluded that an ascent was actually possible, and how exciting is that? So they spent the next month attempting to reach the western Coombe, which a coombe is a bowl-shaped valley. But they were stopped short when a 90-meter or 300-foot wide crevasse stopped their progress. And a crevasse is a really deep crack that forms in a glacier or ice sheet. They can be hundreds of feet deep, and it can be really difficult to rescue somebody if they fall into one, because you can imagine falling into a block of ice, how fast the hypothermia would set in. So many people who fall into crevasses die of hypothermia. And then sometimes there's a sneaky little layer of snow that forms over a crevasse, creating this snow bridge. And those snow bridges blend in with the surrounding landscape, hiding the crevasse. So there's this giant crack hidden under this very thin layer of snow. And if somebody was to walk over it, you can imagine they would plummet into the crevasse. And that's why mountaineers secure themselves to each other with a rope. If one were to fall in, then the other one would also get dragged, but hopefully would have their ice axe to smash into the snow to stop the fall. That's the plan anyways. And then haul the person from the crevasse out. And did you think that was it for dangers on the mountain? Oh, have I got another thing for you. Then there's a little thing called seracs. Crevasses can create these seracs, which are these tall, giant blocks of ice that are formed where several crevasses once met. A serac is commonly house-sized or larger, and with little warning can topple. And icefalls have dozens of seracs. And icefalls are always moving, so those seracs are always falling. Yet another thing to make you not want to climb Mount Everest. In 1952, a Swiss expedition attempted to climb the south route, and after 5 days of effort, they found a way through the icefall and past the crevasse that stopped the 1951 expedition. But the crevasse was still there, so this team first had to descend 18 meters or 60 feet down into it to a snow bridge, then use a precarious rope bridge that they built to get across the other side, and then climb up the other side of the crevasse. But they did it, and on May 27th, 4 climbers made it 8,400 meters or 27,500 feet. 2 of them turned back because they didn't have enough food for everybody, so Tenzing Norgay and Raymond Lambert kept going. But the weather stopped them and they had to turn around just 250 meters or 800 feet shy of the summit. But those British weren't giving up. In 1953, the next year, the 9th British expedition returned to Nepal. And it was massive. It had 350 porters, 20 Sherpas, tons of supplies for 10 climbers. The plan was for 2 summit attempts for each pair of climbers. The first pair went and they made it to 8,750 meters or 28,700 feet, just below the summit. But they couldn't go any further. They were just 100 meters or 300 feet below the summit. They couldn't go any further because their oxygen equipment gave them problems and they ran out of time. 2 days later, the second attempt was made by the fittest and most determined climbing pair, 33-year-old beekeeper Edmund Hillary from New Zealand and 39-year-old Nepali lead Sherpa Tenzing Norgay. Using supplemental oxygen, they reached the summit at 11:30 a.m. They paused at the summit to take photos, which is hilarious because even back in the 50s, they took some selfies. And it was a historic moment, obviously. And Hillary said that after 2 minutes of taking photos without his oxygen on, that he was becoming rather clumsy-fingered and slow-moving. So they headed back down the mountain. Mount Everest had been conquered, and soon commercial expeditions would inundate the mountain, leading to hundreds of deaths and controversies about the commercialization of Everest. In 1992, the first commercial mountaineering expeditions began on Everest. And you might be wondering what the climbing world thought of this. Well, John Krakauer, who was on one of the 1996 teams, he said that early on they had contempt for all those who were climbing Everest because it lacked sufficient technical challenges, and many climbers at the time were actually in the same boat. They were all denigrating Everest and those who were climbing it. And to kind of exacerbate this, in 1985, a wealthy 55-year-old Texan with limited climbing experience got to the top, aided by a young climber named David Brashears, who you'll hear about a little bit later. That Texan went on to climb the 7 summits, the tallest mountain on each continent. So after this, lots of people started doing the 7 summits because they were like, if that Texan dude could do it who has no climbing experience, then so can the rest of us. So they flocked to the 7 summits and they flocked to Everest. In the spring of 1996, there were 30 expeditions on Everest, and at least 10 were commercial. John Krakauer was also a journalist for Outside Magazine and other publications at the time. He wrote essays and articles on mountain climbing, and those were collected in his first book called Eiger Dreams, Ventures Among Men and Mountains. That was published in 1990. And then he wrote Into the Wild, which is about Christopher McCandless. Many of you have probably heard of this story or seen the movie, about the young man who went to Alaska to follow his dreams. One day, Krakauer got a call from the editor of Outside Magazine proposing that he join a guided expedition to Everest in 1995. They wanted him to write about the increasing commercialization. The plan that year was for him to not climb, but just stay at base camp and report the story from there. And he considered it, but he bowed out at the last minute because he thought it would be really frustrating just sitting down at base camp for 2 months while everyone else is climbing. So he proposed something else. That he do it the next year in 1996 and he spend the next year training. It was kind of a long shot because the expense was massive for a magazine. The cost for one person to climb on an expedition was $65,000. Krakauer had been climbing for 33 years and had undertaken some difficult climbs in Alaska, Colorado, and South America. But he did these in his 20s and 30s, and now he was pushing 41 and past his climbing prime, according to him. And he'd never even been as high as Everest Base Camp. And he knew Scott Fisher, owner of Mountain Madness, who was a team going to Everest in 1996. For a while, it looked like Krakauer would be joining Scott's team, but at the last minute, Outside ended up working out a deal with Rob Hall of Adventure Consultants. He ended up charging a lot less than Scott did. And Scott and Rob would lead 2 of the largest commercial expeditions on Everest that year. and they both knew that embedding a journalist in their team could bring much needed attention to their businesses. Hall had one of the most successful guiding companies between 1990 and 1995. During that time, he got 39 climbers to the summit. He had more ascents than any other organization. 1996 would be Rob's 8th expedition. So let's look at the teams now, because these people are big players in the whole story, so you gotta know most of them. Rob Hall was 35 years old and had summited Everest himself 5 times, more than any other non-Sherpa at the time. In 1992, he started a company called Adventure Consultants with his good friend Gary Ball, and it quickly became a premier expedition guiding company. But sadly, Ball died of a pulmonary edema in 1993 while climbing with Rob and another climber. And Rob was devastated, but he kept the company going. For the 1996 season, Rob would be the lead guide, and he hired guides Mike Groom, a 36-year-old Australian, and 31-year-old Andy Harris from New Zealand. Mike Groom actually became the 4th person to reach the 4 highest mountains in the world without bottled oxygen. But about 10 years earlier, Mike had lost all of his toes while climbing in the Himalayas. He froze his feet after being trapped out overnight in the open. Andy Harris had never attempted Everest, but had extensive climbing experience in New Zealand. And in 1985, he climbed a really difficult peak near Everest, which was at almost 7,000 meters or 23,000 feet. On the team, there were also 8 climbing Sherpas and many other Sherpas who were at base camp. As for the clients on the team, there was Frank Fishback, who was 53 and had attempted Everest 3 times, Stuart Hutchinson, who was 34 and a Canadian cardiologist, and he was the youngest client on the team, and he had previous 8,000 meter experience. John Taskey was 56 and the oldest climber on the team and had no 8,000 meter experience. Yasuko Namba was 47 and climbed 6 of the 7 summits. She spent 16 years chasing that goal and would be the oldest woman to summit Everest, the 2nd Japanese woman to do so, and the 1st Japanese woman to complete the 7 summits. And then there was Doug Hansen, who was 46. Doug previously attempted Everest with Hall in the 1995 team. Krakauer talked a little bit about his teammates and said that he really bonded with Doug. He lovingly described him as a wiry, hard-partying man with a prematurely weathered face that brought to mind an old football. What a great friend. Family described him as hardworking and charismatic and said that he had climbed many of the world's tallest mountains. Ed Viesters is a well-known mountaineer with a ton of experience climbing and guiding, and he was on that 1995 team as well, guiding for Rob Hall. That year, they got 5 clients to within 100 meters or 350 feet of the summit, but it would be too dangerous to push on, so they had to turn around. He said that Doug was so keen to go to Everest that he worked the night shift at a post office and worked construction by day. Doug was extremely likable, and Rob was just really disappointed that he hadn't been able to get him to the top, so he offered him a huge discount if he came back in 1996. Lou Kasischke was 53 and a lawyer. He'd been a climber for many years and had climbed mountains all around the world, including 6 of the 7 summits. He was also a marathon runner, endurance athlete, and had climbed in Antarctica at the same time as Rob, and had known him for quite a few years. Beck Weathers was 49 and had been climbing for 10 years and was also making a bid for the 7 summits. Everybody wanted to do the 7 summits, it seems. It was on all of their bucket lists. But Beck had no 8,000 meter experience at the time.
I was pursuing the 7 summits quest, which is to climb the tallest mountain on each of the 7 continents. I got that idea from Dick Bass, who's an irrepressible soul, and had basically pursued that and leaving Everest for number 7.
And he's super honest in his book. He says that he loved mountain climbing, the camaraderie, the adventure, the danger, and even the ego boost that it gave him. He actually fell into climbing as a response to a crushing bout of depression that began in his mid-30s. In the mountains, he could fix his mind. But he was also becoming increasingly self-absorbed. He had climbed 8 other major mountains around the world, and he'd worked like crazy to get there, hell-bent on testing himself against the ultimate challenge. And of course, there was John Krakauer, an accomplished technical climber, but he had no experience over 8,000 meters. Ang Dorje was Rob's climbing sirdar, or lead Sherpa. These Sherpas usually manage all the other Sherpas, and they typically speak English very well. Ang first worked with Rob in 1992, and by 1996 he'd climbed Everest 3 times. Rob said that Ang was crucial for their success. So why did all these folks choose to go with Rob's team? I mean, they were successful, that was for sure. But there's also a few other reasons, and Lou talked about them in his book. He said when he was looking for a team to join, professional leadership with proven experience above 8,000 meters was in short supply at the time. Up until 1996, he thought the risk of dying on Everest was just too great. So he was looking for somebody with a track record of good judgment and decision-making while in the death zone. He said everyone can make the easy decision, but not everyone can make the tough decision. I was looking for a leader who had a record of having the guts to make the hard call. And that's what Rob did in 1995 when he turned around that expedition. Guy Cotter and Ed Viesturs were his assistant guides, and they all made that decision together to turn around at 12:30 p.m. Lou said they recognized that continuing climbing would make it too late for a safe descent. Rob had this predetermined turnaround time, and he stuck to it. The pressure was extreme, getting that close to the summit and saying no to these clients who had paid a ton of money, and there's no second chance and no refunds. But Lou also questioned himself. Would he have the courage and strength to turn around so close to the summit after 6 weeks of extreme physical and mental effort? But as for the guides that Rob hired, Lou was not happy. When he signed up for the team, Rob was supposed to be the expedition leader, and Guy Cotter and Ed Viesturs from 1995 were supposed to be guides. This leadership trio was a huge part of Lou's decision to climb with the team. But he received a call from Rob a couple weeks before they left for Everest, telling him that the planned team wasn't going to work out. Ed and Guy had other commitments and they couldn't work for him that year. Instead, Mike Groom and Andy Harris would be taking their places. And Lou knew nothing about either of them. His concern about Andy grew after he met him because Andy said that he was a novice at high-altitude climbing. Almost everyone on the team had more high-altitude experience. But Lou avoided thinking about that. He trusted Rob, and he focused on Andy's strong climbing ability and the fact that he was a certified guide. Lou says that Mike was hired only 5 weeks earlier and was not a certified guide, and that he was reluctant to serve as leader but did it to help out his friend Rob. Lou is surprised that Mike had only occasionally worked as a guide and never on Everest. And then there was Krakauer. Lou just had a really bad feeling about him being on the team. First of all, none of them were aware that a journalist would be embedded in their team, writing about their every move. Lou said he was really upset to find out that a writer for a major magazine was going to be scribbling notes about them. And this is a time when they're doing the hardest and most dangerous thing that they'd ever done and potentially struggling for their lives. And he said, much worse than reporting facts, he was giving his own subjective judgment performance scorecard that heavily influences public perception. He was reporting back to outside in real time, which was another issue for the team. And no one consented to a journalist on the team. Everest was kind of a private challenge for everybody, and Lou felt really betrayed by Rob. And with that, there was now pressure on Rob to get this journalist to the top and as many climbers as he could because he was going to be written about. Rob could get a huge financial and promotional boost from the outside article. And Lou also felt that as climbers, they were all under greater pressure to push their personal boundaries of acceptable risk and physical limits. And on Everest, the stakes were incredibly high. And then we have the Mountain Madness team. That was Scott Fisher's team. And I've done a video before on Scott Fisher and his whole life, so check that out if you want. The link is in the description below. Scott was 40 at the time, and he guided clients all over the world. He'd had a ton of climbing experience. He'd been climbing since he was a teenager, and he was obsessed with it. He'd been to Everest 4 times. He got to the summit once, and this was his first time leading an expedition up the mountain. Scott started Mountain Madness in the 80s, but it never really gave him a good, steady income. And he knew that commercial success on Everest would draw clients from all over, and it would help the business tremendously. And the news that Scott was joining the Everest game was not good news to his competitors, especially Rob Hall, who was trying to break into the US market where Scott was from. In addition to Scott, we have Anatoli Bukriv, who was 38, and Neil Beidelman, who was 36. Anatoli was from Kazakhstan and considered one of the world's foremost high-altitude climbers. By spring of 1996, he'd climbed 7 of the most challenging climbs over 8,000 meters, some more than once, and climbed all without using supplemental oxygen. Neil was 36 and an aerospace engineer. He had no Everest experience, but plenty of climbing experience. Anatoli said Neil had extraordinary endurance because he was an ultra-marathon runner. And now the clients on the team. Martin Adams was 47 and had climbed Aconcagua, Denali, and Kilimanjaro, but had never been over 8,000 meters. He was excited that Anatoli was hired, and he felt that their chances of success were higher now that he was a guide on the team. Martin was actually on a team with Anatoli and Neil climbing Miraculous, the 5th highest mountain in the world, in 1994 and got to 7,400 meters. But most importantly, he trusted Anatoli's judgment and experience. Charlotte Fox was 38 and climbed all 53 of the 14,000-meter peaks in Colorado, and she summited 5 of the world's 8,000-meter peaks. Beck said that Charlotte Fox was one of his favorites. He'd climbed with her and Sandy Hill Pittman in Antarctica. Tim Madsen was 33 and Charlotte's boyfriend. He climbed extensively in Colorado and the Canadian Rockies with Charlotte, but he didn't have any 8,000-meter experience. Dale Cruz was 45 and a longtime friend of Scott's and had no 8,000-meter experience. According to many, he was the least strong on the team because of that lack of experience. And you may have heard of Sandy Hill Pittman. She was also on the team, and I have a video about her as well that you could check out. But we're going to get into more details about her in this video. She's a wee bit controversial. She was 41 at the time and climbed 6 of the 7 summits. And she was one of the climbers on the team with 8,000-meter experience. And she was kind of serving as a journalist on this team, sending daily updates to NBC. Since Scott couldn't get Krakauer, he felt that signing on Sandy was a bit of a prize because she also had more high-altitude experience and she was going to be sending dispatches to the media. If Scott got her to the top, that would be a huge deal, really good for business. But then there was the other side. If he didn't get her to the top, it could be a publicity fiasco. And then there was Pete Shunning, who was 68 and a legendary climber. He was well known for single-handedly saving the lives of 6 people during a mass fall on K2 in 1953. If he was able to summit Everest, he'd be the oldest person to do so. His nephew Clev was 38 and a former U.S. national downhill ski racer. He had no 8,000-meter experience, but had a pretty solid climbing resume. And then there was Lena Gamelgard, and she was 35. She'd climbed with Scott many other times, and he was the one who actually suggested that she come to Everest with him. She said her and Scott were similar in that they were like wild kids, capable of behaving properly, but completely incapable of being controlled by anyone else. And inner discipline, she said, was not what Scott was best at. But she really grew to like Anatoli, even though he was a little bit misogynistic with her when she first met him. He asked her early on, "Why do you want to climb? You're a woman." That's my Russian accent. But then he followed that up with, if you want to climb Everest, you must have the will to suffer. And he really grew on her. She really grew to love him. He was really caring, kind, and of course a very competent climber. So she felt the team was really strong and in great shape and high spirits when they first met. There were also 8 climbing Sherpas on the team, including Lopsang Jangbu, who was the lead climbing Sherpa and a friend of Scott's. As the lead climbing Sherpa, Lopsang was responsible for the high-altitude Sherpas. But Anatoli wasn't sure about him. Since Lopsang was only 23 years old, even though he had summited with Scott on his successful 1994 ascent of Everest, it wasn't really his experience, but Lopsang's youthfulness that made Anatoli nervous. Henry Todd, a Himalayan guide, said that the position of lead Sherpa takes a long time. You have to prove yourself over and over again, leading as well as climbing. His intuition about Lopsang was that he was going to make all sorts of mistakes and he could well blow it big time. And then there's the IMAX team. Earlier I talked about Ed Viesters, who was supposed to be a guide on Rob's team, but it fell through. And this is why, because Ed was recruited by David Brashears, who is a filmmaker and climber. They were going to work on the first IMAX movie of Mount Everest. So speaking of Krakauer scribbling notes about people, when he was describing others on the mountain that year, he said that the credentials of many who came to climb the mountain in 1996 were as thin as mine or thinner. He said, in assessing their own abilities, half the population at base camp was clinically delusional. And Ed Viesters kind of reiterated that, and he said that a lot of people were up there who simply shouldn't have been. And they knew that none of them had any hope of summiting without considerable help from Sherpas and guides. But Krakauer did say that his team was far more competent than most of the climbers on the mountain, and he acknowledged that Scott's team was more experienced than Rob's team. And then there's the Taiwanese team. Krakauer said that they were ill-equipped and didn't seem to know what they were doing. He said they weren't familiar with the standard tools and techniques of glacier travel. They would climb across the ladders, which are really sketchy, and you'd usually cross one person at a time, but they would do it 2 at a time, making it more dangerous. And they kept snagging their crampons as they were walking and stumbling all over the place. It was like they didn't know how to walk with them. Makalu Gao Mingho was leading the 5-member Taiwanese team. The previous year, the team ran into trouble on Denali in Alaska. 9 climbers reached the summit, but 7 were caught in the storm on the descent and became disoriented. They spent the night out at 6,100 meters or 20,000 feet. Conrad Anker and Alex Lowe, two of the most skilled alpinists at the time, were also on Denali and stopped their climb to help the Taiwanese. And they were barely alive, the Taiwanese climbers. Conrad and Alex helped get them down the mountain, and 5 members had severe frostbite and 1 died. And as Miraculous, the leader, was being hauled down the mountain by 2 guides, he yelled out to everyone, "Victory, victory, we made it to the summit!" As if this horrible disaster and death didn't just happen. So odd. Conrad said that it was a weird moment for sure. So when that same Taiwanese team showed up on Everest, everyone was wondering if they would run into the same issue as on Denali, where everyone else had to abandon their summit attempt to help. Rob said with so many incompetent climbers on the mountain that year, it was unlikely they'd get away without something bad happening. And he was right. So teams start out flying into Kathmandu, which lies at 1,371 meters or 4,500 feet above sea level, and it's east of the Himalayan mountains. It's the capital of Nepal and the most populous city in the country with around 845,000 people. It's one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in the world. So for summiting Everest, you can imagine that logistics are a massive piece of it and a critical piece of a successful climb. There's tons of food, equipment, supplies that have to be moved halfway around the world and across borders and 60 miles up the Khumbu Valley to base camp. Teams flew from Kathmandu about 100 miles to the village of Lukla, where they would begin a week-long trek into Everest base camp. And this trek to base camp is an important first step in preparing the body to acclimatize to the high altitude. They needed to go really slow as their bodies adjusted to the altitudes. If they didn't go slow, they would risk getting sick. Everest base camp alone is at 5,346 meters or 17,600 feet, which is higher than all but 2 points in the US. Beck described the hike in and said that every once in a while you come around a turn and there off in the distance is this giant rock, nearly 6 miles high, thrusting its head up above everything around it. And one of the dangers along with just hiking to base camp is people getting stomach bugs from the food and water along the way. It seems to be pretty common. And before even reaching base camp, Andy Harris suffered from multiple gastrointestinal attacks. He was advised to stop and rest for a night, but he proceeded to base camp with the rest of the team. And this is dangerous because it compromised his ability to acclimatize slowly to the altitude. At base camp, Sherpas would use picks and shovels to level the ice and rubble to set up a cook tent, a tent for equipment, and a communications tent. Base camp is basically a tent town of around 300 people on this glacier, which is always moving. Beck said that Rob's camp was the grandest of them all, and each climber had their own tent. Teams also had solar-powered satellite phones, faxes, stereos, and outdoor showers. And there's lots of boredom at base camp because most of the time they spend there is resting and recovering from climbing. But that didn't stop the parties from happening. Beck recalled one night where people were dancing on the table in the dining tent. But despite the ability to party, just being at base camp at that altitude was tiring for people. Beck talks about if somebody was transported from their home at sea level to the top of Everest, they'd be unconscious in the first few minutes and then dead shortly after that. The body can't withstand that enormous physiological shock of being placed in an oxygen-deprived environment. He said the moment you arrive at base camp, you're aware that every motion you make seems to suck the oxygen out of your body. And the climbers are actually kind of spoiled on Everest. Krakauer describes how every morning the Sherpas would bring them steaming mugs of tea while they were still in their sleeping bags in their tents. The Sherpas had to rise earlier than everybody else, collect water in a near glacial pond, heat it, and then make the morning wake-up rounds with tea to all the tents. Anatoli described base camp and said that in the mess tent there were always thermoses of Starbucks coffee, there were sports drinks, power bars, beef jerky, and the meals they ate were often really rich like pizzas and stews. One thing that was annoying to a few clients was the focus on the media and getting information out to the media. Lena talked about their communications tent, which was full of equipment, and Sandy would make daily reports and do interviews regularly. The doctor's clinic was also in this tent. And people give Sandy crap for all the extra gear she had, and there's no doubt she had a ton of extra equipment and even had it carried up to really high altitudes. But she actually also paid for extra Sherpas to carry all her gear, so her expense ended up being quite a bit more than the $65,000 price tag. People say that her equipment was unnecessary and extravagant, but when teams are bringing up Starbucks coffee and booze for parties, that argument kind of loses strength.
Hangout tents with an espresso machine and a pool table. Just like this go like, wow. Anyone hungry? This is why I come back to Everest.
Especially at an age when, now today, streaming to the media, getting news out via the internet is commonplace, but back then it wasn't. So it was a little bit more odd to see, and so it probably stuck out to people. And at that time, communications equipment was becoming more common. Of the 14 teams at base camp, about half had satellite phones.
Hi, Sandy. Sandy's communication tent.
This time, Pittman came packing sophisticated satellite equipment provided by NBC. Her reports were filed over the internet as the teams went up the mountain. For the first time, climbing Everest had become a worldwide spectator sport, and Rob Hall and Scott Fisher had the most to gain.
And Lena, she had mixed emotions about the media circus, but she realized that she was also benefiting from the power of the press. If it wasn't for the Danish media, she wouldn't even be there. After a few days at base camp, things were not rosy for everyone. Lena talked about the health of their team, and at this point, Scott was in excellent form, better than she'd ever seen him. She said Anatoli was a monster, he was in great condition, and had been there a week ahead of everybody, so he was well acclimatized. Sandy was in great shape and high spirits, but had a crazy cough and had to take some medicine for it. Charlotte was an iron woman, just in top form, but she also had issues with coughing, and that was not uncommon. Both her and Sandy had to use inhalers at high altitude. And Martin was in great shape, but he also coughed like crazy at night. Lena said Neil was in great shape and very fast, but he also coughed up this green slime, but that seemed to be typical for him at high altitude. Anatoli is concerned with Neil's cough, though, because he was a guide and had to be 100%. Tim and Dale were both in good condition and slept well. Both had a bit of altitude sickness, but it wasn't too bad. And P was in good shape, but he had trouble sleeping and had to sleep with oxygen. Cleve was in super condition, and she described him as being tough and calm. Lena says she was in great form. She felt great and was doing well at high altitude. She had a slow start, but felt that she was on an upward curve. Anatoli had some concerns, though, and one was about the radios that Scott brought. There were these old radios, and radios are a critical item in an expedition. It's so guides can communicate with each other on the mountain, and they can communicate with base camp. It's a conduit for information for developing problems, emergencies, or weather. And Martin, he also said the radios were a joke, and when he asked Scott about them, Scott just said that was all he had. But for Martin, it was a major misstep for Scott to take these old, crappy radios. As they spent more time at base camp, they got to know each other and hang out a little bit more, and Lou frequently sat with Doug at dinner. Doug was still hung up on his last Everest attempt, and he couldn't get it out of his mind. He told Lou that every day since the 1995 attempt, he thought about Everest. And as they talked one night, Lou learned from Doug that there were 11 expedition permits this season, and that struck him as being really high. In the previous decade, there were only 3 to 4 per year. Lou wondered if 11 permits would have an effect on their summit attempt, and if he should be alarmed. Would it make climbing more dangerous? But he had no idea what the impact would be, so he asked Rob about it. Rob said he wasn't concerned, and Lou just accepted that. Krakauer talks about how Lou, Beck, and Stewart unpacked these brand new mountaineering boots that they barely wore. He wonders if they knew the risks of that because he'd done the same decades earlier and paid the price with debilitating foot injuries. But interestingly, Beck said that he never bought the idea that you needed to break in new mountaineering boots. Either they fit or they didn't, and he'd done that before. Unfortunately, his new boots rubbed both of his shins, which were soon ulcerated wounds. And any wounds at high altitude, they just don't heal, so he knew he wouldn't recover until he was off the mountain. So his strategy was to keep the boots pretty loose, but no matter what he did, each step was total agony. He had to wrap his shins in bandages and just suck it up and learn to live with the pain. Then Stewart realized that his crampons didn't fit his new boots, so Rob had to make a special strap for him. And on top of these issues, Krakauer said he was shocked to learn that most of the fellow climbers had rarely had the opportunity to go climbing more than once or twice in the previous year. He said although everyone is in superb physical shape, most of the training was on Stairmasters and treadmills rather than actual peaks. And Krakauer didn't feel that climbing could be replicated in a gym. The window for good climbing weather on Everest is short and occurs in the months of May and September. The top of Everest is engulfed by those jet streams that I talked about earlier for a major part of the year, so it's impossible to climb it. The earliest summit attempts ever in May had been on May 5th, 2009, and the latest was on May 18th, 2012. So you can see that window is very, very short. And there's actually about 18 to 20 different climbing routes on Everest. But 98% of all climbers choose either the north or south route. For almost everyone, the other routes are just too dangerous, difficult, and not commercially guided. On the south route, climbers start off on the Khumbu icefall. And in all the things you read about the icefall, it's unanimously one of the most dangerous and feared sections of climbing Everest. It's 2,000 feet high, and crossing the icefall can take 3 to 5 hours for a fit climber who's properly acclimatized. But for somebody who's average conditioned with no acclimatization, it can take 12 hours. Camp 1 is around 6,000 meters or 19,685 feet, and it's at the end of the icefall. It's a vast area with endless snow, deep crevasses, and dangerous ice walls prone to avalanches. And what's weird is that climbers can also experience this extreme heat in this section because there's no natural protection from the sun and it bounces off the snowy walls, intensifying the heat. Camp 2 is at 6,400 meters or 21,000 feet. The climb to Camp 3 via the Lhotse wall can be very challenging. It's basically just a sheet of ice with sporadic rockfall coming down from above. People traverse this section using fixed ropes. Camp 3 is at 7,200 meters or 23,625 feet. It's carved into the mountain and tents must be secured to the mountain wall for safety. To reach Camp 4, climbers must traverse 2 rocky sections which lead into that lovely place called the Death Zone. And then Camp 4 is fully in the Death Zone at 8,016 meters or 26,300 feet. And this camp rests on a plateau between Mount Everest and Lhotse, the 4th highest mountain in the world. After this, to get to the summit, climbers cross a sharp and steep ridge with the Hillary Step in the middle. And the Hillary Step is a steep rock face and the last major obstacle before summiting. Because there were so many teams, the expedition leaders had to have a meeting to figure out the day that each of them was going to summit. A large number of climbers in certain areas, such as the final part of the Hillary Step, could be a major safety problem. They decided to spread teams out to avoid the bottleneck or the lineup of people waiting to climb. Standing there still and not moving in the death zone at those extreme temperatures is really dangerous. And climbers have to get to the summit by that turnaround time that I talked about earlier. That allows them to have enough time to get back down before dark and to ensure they have enough oxygen to get back down. So any delays are really dangerous.
On May 4th, hoping to avoid a traffic jam up the mountain, expedition leaders met to coordinate their summit attempts. There is only a brief 2-week window in May when the ferocious weather is calm enough to give climbers a chance to make it to the top. David Brashears was there, and Scott Fisher, and Rob Hall, already working to make sure discipline would be maintained.
Maybe I'll get unpopular, but somebody has to be unpopular sometimes.
Rob's team was going to summit on May 10th, a day which he thought of as his lucky day. And they'd be going on the same day as Scott's team. According to Lou, this was unexpected, unlikely, illogical, and irrational. Alarm bells rang off in his head when he heard this, and he saw that the rest of his team was puzzled too. The whole point was for leaders to spread out on separate days to avoid the congestion, so why would Rob plan for the 2 largest expeditions to go to the summit on the same day? The number of people on those 2 teams was more than all the other teams combined, so it made no sense to Lou. And Rob made the decision without consulting anyone on the team, which annoyed Lou, but at the same time Rob, he was paid to make those hard decisions. But Lou said it was a major strategic departure from their expectations and climbing plan. He said in Rob's prior Everest expeditions, he never planned to go to the summit on the same day with another team, large or small. So this was not the time to do a practice round. And it was also a practice round with this untested leadership team. When the team questioned Rob about this, he downplayed their concerns, Lou said, with empty, aggressive rhetoric. And he said they were reading too much into it. He said they weren't combining teams or climbing together and that they'd probably never even be in the same place at the same time. He said, Everest is a big place, you know. And then the discussion ended. And in the end, Rob's words reassured Lou because he just simply trusted Rob. Lou later said for some reason it served Rob's interest, but he wasn't sure at the time why. Lou said, I'd only come later to understand the real reason. And if there had been no same-day decision, there would have been no 1996 tragedy. The IMAX team was also concerned about the mob on Everest. It posed a few problems for the film. Aesthetically, they didn't want footage of dozens of climbers straggling around in the background. And it also posed a safety dilemma to Ed, who reiterated that too many climbers in certain spots can create the bottleneck, which is a danger for everyone. Team leaders also talked about who would fix ropes. And by fixing rope, that just means that guides or Sherpas go ahead and put ropes in really dangerous parts so clients can clip into them and not get blown off the mountain. So one team took on the icefall, fixing ropes, and higher up, ropes fixed by various teams would be used by all the teams. The IMAX team agreed to get out one day ahead of everyone, and they aimed for a May 9th summit. The Sherpas would establish the camps above, and they'd shuttle the huge loads of gear, food, cooking stuff, tents from camp to camp. Meanwhile, the climbers would focus on acclimatizing to the altitude, and Beck describes how his team did this. Over several weeks, they would start at base camp, climb up past the icefall, and then climb back down again. They would rest and then push up a little higher next time, then come back down again, and rest and do it again. They do this until the body begins to acclimatize, but it takes time. If you climb too fast, you risk that high-altitude pulmonary edema in which your lungs fill with fluid and prevent you from obtaining sufficient oxygen. These symptoms can be quickly reversed if the person goes to lower altitude. But even deadlier is high-altitude cerebral edema, where accumulated fluid causes the brain to swell. It's a medical emergency and the person should get to lower altitude immediately. And some people are just more susceptible than others to both of these. Even veteran climbers can develop either without warning. Then there's hypoxia, which is much more common and caused by reduced supply of oxygen to the brain. It induces euphoria, it makes people a little goofy and confused, but severe hypoxia can rob you of your judgment and common sense, which is obviously very dangerous when you have to make critical decisions. And it can also quickly morph into high-altitude cerebral edema. So teams come up with acclimatization schedules, and Scott and Anatoli worked out theirs for their team. They would do 4 excursions up and down the mountain, and it would be mandatory for all the clients. So the guides and Scott could monitor them to make sure they're acclimatizing properly before the summit bid.
We are making history and we are setting protocol. So let's take care of our mountain.
One of Scott's employees at base camp noticed that he was physically tired by now. She said that he would get up in the morning and that it would take him about 5 minutes to finally stand up. And he was exhausted. He was taking Diamox every other day, which is commonly prescribed to help with acclimatization. The morning schedule for Scott's team looks something like this. Wake up with their little Sherpa tea at 4:30 in the morning, breakfast would be at 5, and then they would depart at 5:30. They'd climb as far as possible and then turn around at noon no matter where they were. When the sun gets high enough to warm the ice on the icefall, Lena said, shit starts to happen up there. So they try and get back down before midday. So when teams started on their first acclimatization excursion, they headed up that terrifying icefall, which starts right above base camp where the Khumbu Glacier pushes itself out over a 2,000-foot precipice. A climber will spend about 20 hours total on the icefall with all the trips up and down. And you may have seen images of people precariously walking along on the aluminum ladders. Well, those are how they cross over those massive deep crevasses, and they had to walk over these bridges in their crampons, which are 2-inch long metal spikes at the bottom of their boots. So they had to place them very securely on the ladder rungs and go step by step. Those ladders are anchored to the shifting ice and lashed to one another. Beck realized that on all the round trips that they were doing, they would cross approximately 700 ladder bridges. And this was one thing that all the climbers seemed to agree on, that the icefall was scary. Krakauer describes it as terrifying and heart-pounding. The risks are always extreme because that glacier is moving on average of 2 to 3 feet each day. And this causes the deep crevasses to open and close and for seracs to collapse without warning. Lou said climbing the icefall is like a game of Russian roulette. He said, as a climber, you have no control over the blocks of ice, but you know that each and every one you pass over or under will one day collapse. Martin said when they got to some of the ladders, some people would walk across normally, some would crawl, and others would scooch across on their butts. And he said that Lena and Sandy were actually the best across the ladders because they were very well balanced and they weren't really intimidated by the crevasses below them. Charlotte found that scooching across on her butt worked best. And Lena described one horrifying part of the icefall called the mouse trap. And you can only imagine what that is. It was this massive leaning tower of ice which loomed above the climbers at this frightening angle. The only way to pass it was up and over, and this serac was going to fall, but the only question was when. Hopefully when you're not under it or on it. Everyone on Scott's team made it through in the time required. Rob's team climbed up to Camp 1 but stayed for less than an hour before heading back down. Krakauer, always watching his teammates, assessed his fellow clients' climbing skills on this day, which I'm sure they just loved. He said that Beck and especially Yasuko looked the weakest and appeared to be in danger of falling off the ladders and plummeting into a crevasse. He also said that Yasuko didn't know how to use crampons, which I really question considering her climbing history. She did the 7 summits, and although they aren't all like Mount Everest, some are actually technically quite easy, but of the 7 summits, 5 of them require the use of crampons. Krakauer was impressed with Scott's team, though. He said that they went by at an impressive clip. Lena recalls getting to the top of the icefall after 5 hours, and she was absolutely elated because she thought it would take her about 8 or 9 hours. And as she stepped onto the western comb and spun around to see Everest, Lhotse, and Nuptse, 3 massive cliffs, each one incredible on their own, and together they were just overwhelming. Anatoli was pleased with the performance of his team, but surprised by the number of clients who didn't have the self-reliance to move through the icefall on their own, without being constantly monitored by a guide. He wondered what would happen when no one was there to hold their hands. And tensions were mounting as Sandy and Lena started to butt heads, and both of them were driving Neil crazy. Then Neil got stuck with helping Sandy with her technical equipment, which he didn't really have to do, but he was helping her out. Emotions were ramping up as teams got higher and more tired on the mountain. Lena noticed that now Scott, Neil, Sandy, and Martin were all feeling sick and taking altitude medicine. On their second trip up, this time they're going to spend 2 nights at Camp 1 and then continue to Camp 2 for 3 additional nights before heading back down. Krakauer was getting dizzy from that heat. The sun was on the glacier and it felt like a huge solar oven. And that's when he came across what he thought was something wrapped in blue plastic sheeting. It took his impaired brain a few minutes to realize that it was a body, the first body they had seen. He was shocked and disturbed and just kind of stared at it for a few minutes. And then there was more bodies up the mountain. Up to that point, over 600 people had attempted Everest, with about 130 dying on the mountain. Those who die are brought down only if they're below a certain altitude and if the transporting of them doesn't really pose a huge risk to the rescuers. If a climber dies high up on the mountain, recovering the body requires almost an expedition and is a risk to more injuries and casualties, so it's not done very often. And the Sherpas believe that it brings misfortune if you remove the dead from the mountain. On the third trip up to Camp 3, Anatoli noticed the climbers didn't really have the enthusiasm they had the day before. The increase in altitude was having an impact on everyone. Pete was behind the team, and he was much slower, so Scott was climbing with him. Meanwhile, Scott was still looking really tired. Anatoli thought that he was worn out from all the logistical things that he was doing and didn't have much rest after his last acclimatization excursion. And this is when Scott took Anatoli aside and told him that he wasn't doing a great job, which Anatoli was shocked to hear. He thought he was working really hard. He had been working and climbing nonstop and setting up tents. Scott told him that he wasn't very attentive to the clients and didn't help them set up their tents. But at the time, Anatoli was helping the Sherpas set up the tents, so he felt the clients didn't really need help and actually thought that them working hard would help their acclimatization. But Scott didn't agree. Anatoli started to feel that there was this misunderstanding as to why he was hired. Neil told him that clients wanted their hands held since many haven't been over 8,000 meters, and Anatoli just thought that was absurd. He was not the kind to hold hands of anyone. He really thought that people should be self-sufficient, and many people do say that you need to be totally independent on Everest, and you need to be able to save yourself and not rely on anyone else. Veteran climbers will tell you that. Anatoli felt that they needed to encourage the self-reliance with the clients, but Neil disagreed and told him that he didn't think that even half of the clients would even summit. Lena thought that Scott was accusing him of not socializing with people and that that's what he was hired to do instead of working hard high on the mountain, which Anatoli thought was his job. And on top of that, Anatoli had Krakauer going in on him about his clothing. Krakauer said that Anatoli was underdressed and pointed out to others that he was wearing running shoes while climbing, and kind of mocked him for it in the book. But for Anatoli, this was totally normal practice for him. They were not ordinary runners. They were these shot-putting shoes with spikes on the bottom that were given to him by a friend on the Russian Olympic team. They were light, and that's exactly what he wanted, so he could fly up the mountain quickly. And he'd been using these for years. All of his equipment was reduced to a minimum. Plus, the guy was one of the best climbers around, so ridiculing his footwear or clothing just seems so ridiculous. And Anatoli heard that other climbers started making fun of him for this, which he just thought was petty and dumb. Martin was growing increasingly dismayed at the way the expedition was being managed. He said logging onto the internet seems to be more of a priority than logistics. He was upset at this time that Camp 3 hadn't been established, and not being able to go there would break his acclimatization routine. And Camp 3 wasn't in place because Scott's team was shorthanded and the winds were fierce, turning back people who were trying to set up the tents. According to Anatoli's book, clients were growing increasingly frustrated with all the delays. One client anonymously said that Scott, Neil, and Anatoli didn't seem to be paying attention to details, and that Neil and Scott would go zipping by each other like they were racing. The weather stabilized on April 25th, and Anatoli went to fix the ropes between Camps 3 and 4 with Ang Dorje of Rob's team. People were really getting on each other's nerves now. Who knows if it was the exhaustion, being with each other for so long, weeks after weeks in close quarters. But Lena admitted that she really didn't like Neil. She said that he needed to be worshipped as a guide, and she wasn't going to do that. He would tell her the most basic things about climbing that she already knew. She was really angry at him and at one point just totally lost it on him and told him to stay away or she'd kill him. So tensions were obviously ramping up. She said, "I think he had a hard time with me." At that point, Dale wasn't doing well, so they sent him down the mountain, and Scott ended up going all the way down to base camp with him, which was not planned. This was kind of an extra trip down, all the way down to base camp for him, and this was a huge concern to Anatoli because Scott's acclimatization routine and schedule had been broken repeatedly. They finally made it to Camp 3 and spent the night there. The next trip up would be the actual summit bid. One more trip up and down the mountain. Krakauer shared a tent with Doug, and when they got up in the morning, Doug said that he just felt like shit. He thought something was terribly wrong with his throat and said that he was getting too old for this stuff. He didn't think he could continue. By the time they got back down to Camp 2, Doug had serious frostbite on several toes. The year before, he had frostbitten his feet so badly that he lost some tissue from his big toe, which permanently impaired circulation. But even worse was the injury to Doug's respiratory tract. Less than 2 weeks before leaving for Nepal, he had minor throat surgery, leaving his trachea in extremely sensitive condition. That morning, Krakauer said Doug froze his throat. And then Doug just said the climb's over for him. He didn't think he could summit and he was done. But Rob came in and told him not to write himself off just yet, to wait and see how he felt after a couple days of rest. He said, "I think you still have a good shot at the top once you recover." But Rob could not have been more wrong. Pete and Dale were struggling, Yasuko and Beck were not as strong as they should have been. There was tension among the guides and Scott was exhausted. On top of that, Lobsang, his number one Sherpa, was coughing and vomiting really badly as he tried to acclimatize. Things were really starting to fall apart for a lot of people. Lou was concerned about the unproven guides on the team and wondered if they would step up and make the hard decisions if they needed to while in the death zone. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Rob and Scott, the Taiwanese team also chose to summit on the same day. That meant on May 10th there would be over 40 climbers heading for the summit, and 5 of those people would never get off the mountain. Lou Kosishki was on Rob's team, and he was a pretty experienced climber and very vocal about this plan. He didn't agree with it. He said Rob had never joined forces with another team, and these were 2 of the largest expeditions on the mountain that year. Too many climbers in certain spots on the mountain can create these lineups which lead to delays, and delays this high can be deadly. The climb to the summit has to be within a certain time frame, usually around 12 hours, from the highest camp to the summit. The climb back down to Camp 4 is about 6 hours. And they want to get back to Camp 4 before dark, which is about 6:30 p.m. And if there's delays, that means that people will also run out of supplemental oxygen, as there's only about 18 hours of oxygen for each person. And running out of oxygen in the death zone can mean a quick death. Anatoli Bukriv was a guide on Scott's Mountain Madness team, and he also expressed concern about the decision to join forces and told Scott that Rob's clients could slow them up because they were a slower team overall. And many climbers on the team felt the same way. But for whatever reason, Scott and Rob were determined to join forces. Lou said in his book that the most important part of any summit day plan is the turnaround time. This is the time climbers turn around on the mountain no matter where they are, and they head back down. Lou believed that ignoring this time would be unsafe, irresponsible, and reckless. Rob set the turnaround time for 1 p.m. and emphasized to his team that if you're not back in camp in daylight, you will die. Rob's team was leaving Camp 4 for the summit around 11 p.m., so Lou thought that the turnaround time should have been around 11 a.m., giving them 12 hours to get up there. And Rob's turnaround time was only possible in the most ideal circumstances. If everything went perfect, they'd be up and back at 5 p.m., 12 hours up and 6 hours back. Journalist John Krakauer, who was on Rob's team, said that Rob lectured them for weeks on the mountain on the importance of the turnaround time. Rob told them that everyone had to abide by this time no matter where they were on the mountain. He also said that with enough determination, any bloody idiot can get up this hill. The trick is to get back down alive. Beck Weathers recalls Rob saying, if you're not moving fast enough to get to the summit by 2 p.m., you're not moving fast enough to get down before darkness traps you on the mountain forever. And according to all of the clients on Scott's team, he really didn't have a specific turnaround time. Though most climbers know that the conventional time was 1 or 2 p.m., but Scott never explicitly gave his team a time. Instead, he would kind of just see how things were going and then set a turnaround time while climbing, or he would turn back the weaker clients as he climbed at the back of the team. Team spent a week resting before their final push to the summit on May 6th. Anatoli felt that hiking beyond base camp, further down to lower elevation, would be even better for rest. He suggested to Scott that everyone descend to Débouché, a village in the forest at about 3,800 meters or 12,500 feet, and that's where the oxygen-rich atmosphere would promote a better physical recovery. But Scott consulted with Rob and they decided against it. They were worried that their team might catch a stomach bug lower down, which was highly possible because a lot of people caught stomach bugs as they were hiking in. But Anatoli decided to go down to Débouché by himself, which is about a 20-kilometer or 12-mile hike. He was disappointed that Scott, Neil, and some other clients hadn't done the same. On May 5th, Anatoli noticed Sandy Hill Pittman was gone. She had descended with her 3 Sherpas to meet 3 of her friends who had hiked into Ferrochet, and this is about a 12.5-kilometer or 8-mile hike from Everest Base Camp. It surprised Anatoli that someone with her experience in the mountains would make such a rapid descent and return on the same day just before a summit bid. An extended rest is beneficial, but a quick up and down would cost her a great deal of energy. Charlotte Fox and Tim Madsen, they were a couple from Colorado, and Charlotte was like the queen of mountaineering in Colorado. And if you read some of the comments on her, everybody just seems to love Charlotte, and she just seemed like an awesome human being. She had a ton of experience, had done all the climbs that you could possibly do in Colorado, and had climbed all over the world. But Anatoli was concerned with their acclimatization because they hadn't yet spent a night at Camp 3 like everybody else. But Scott was going to let them ascend anyways, and he would monitor their progress. And Anatoli didn't know it at the time, but Tim and Charlotte actually had their own concerns about summiting. They told Scott that they didn't want to go on the planned summit day. Instead, they wanted to wait a little bit longer and try acclimatizing properly before they went for the summit. But Scott had to maintain a timeline and this group of people, and he wasn't able to do another summit bid in addition to the one they were already going to do. So they were kind of stuck with that summit day. While Charlotte didn't address the conversation with Scott in anything that I've seen from her, she did say that she'd been struggling with exercise-induced asthma and a lung infection, but both were under control at the time thanks to some medicine she was taking. She said Tim had a lot of headaches and that during rest time they'd go all the way down to Ferrochet to recover. Anatoli said other clients were no better or no worse than he expected, but Scott was having problems. He also couldn't understand why Scott and Neil had hiked to Pomori to take photos. Pomori is a mountain about 8 kilometers or 5 miles so west of Everest. I'm not sure how high they climbed on this mountain, but they did spend the night there, and Neil said that it was a nice break from everybody else and for them to be alone and kind of discuss the upcoming summit plans. But this was an expensive energy that Anatoli just felt wasn't necessary, and he later learned that Scott developed an illness over that week and had begun taking antibiotics. He also took medication to help with acclimatization, so he was obviously having some issues. Sandy returned to base camp the night before their final push to the summit. The next morning at 5 a.m., she was back at work in her communications tent. The internet dispatch she sent out was upbeat, enthusiastic, and strangely focused on her meal at the restaurant the night before, which Anatoli found quite odd, considering what they were just about to do. In 2 hours, they were going to be climbing to the summit of Mount Everest, and it's odd that she didn't mention that. That morning, Martin Adams of Scott's team went into the mess tent for breakfast and saw Scott and the doctor in a deep conversation that he said looked tense. He said whatever they were discussing, they didn't want to share it with others. So it makes you wonder if the doctor was questioning Scott's ability to climb, and was the doctor noticing his exhaustion like other people were. And while still at base camp, Scott's head Sherpa Lopsang also took an unexpected trip. He had to go back to Kathmandu with his injured uncle, and Lopsang had to rush back to base camp, so he didn't properly acclimatize. And at this point, Lou had serious intestinal problems that he said were almost mental torture. Part of him was embarrassed to have to consider not attempting the summit bid due to diarrhea, so he was just going to go for it. So next morning, his alarm went off at 3:45 a.m. on May 6th. He went to the mess tent and he could just feel the tension. People were quiet. This was their last move up the mountain and they were nervous. Rob, though, moved around with his usual confidence, and they were now 4 days from the highest point on Earth. Despite some climbers battling sickness, others not acclimatizing properly, and everyone being nervous, the summit bid was still a go. On May 6th, the plan was to climb to Camp 2, and that would take about 7 to 10 hours. They'd spend the night at Camp 2 resting, evaluating conditions, and making those final summit plans. On May 8th, they would climb straight up to Camp 3, and this would take about 3 hours. On the morning of May 9th, if everything was still a go, they'd climb further up the Lhotse face to Camp 4 at about 7,924 meters, or 26,000 feet, just below the death zone. This would take about 3 to 5 hours. There, they'd rest for only a few hours, and then, if everything was still a go, they'd continue the climb later that night to the summit. It would take them about 12 hours to get to the summit, so they'd arrive around 11 to 12 the next day. Then they'd turn around and be back at Camp 4 before dark. And an interesting thing to note here is that in the previous 5 to 10 years before this, an average of only 3 days were doable summit days. That's where the weather was good enough to make the climb. It was a very, very small window. And this year, that window hadn't quite opened up yet. And there was no official forecast to help with this. Rather, it was just a judgment call of really monitoring and understanding the weather patterns. The leaders who were paid to make these critical decisions failed to see that the weather window had, in fact, not opened up yet. The climb from base camp to Camp 2 would take climbers about 5 to 7 hours. It's only about 2.5 miles from Camp 1 to 2, so it's not very far, but it's very, very hot. The sun reflects off the walls and can make the temperatures over 37 degrees Celsius or 100 Fahrenheit. But some of the climbers were just super happy that they were going to be done climbing up that dreaded icefall. On the morning of May 9th, Anatoli met with Scott after breakfast. Scott had stayed behind to ensure that all the clients got off okay, and they both agreed that Anatoli would head up last, to save his strength and move at his own pace to Camp 2. Scott's team started arriving at Camp 1, and Dale Cruz wasn't doing well. Dale was a friend of Scott's who was the most inexperienced climber on the team. Rob had to tell Dale that his summit attempt was over, so he ended up climbing all the way down to base camp with Dale, which was a huge expense of Scott's energy, and they ran into Anatoli on the way down. Anatoli's version of this is that he ran into Scott and Dale as they were coming down the icefall, and he offered to take Dale down the rest of the way because he said Scott looked upset, but Scott told him that he would do it himself. And this is where Krakauer's account differs. He heard the story from Dale, who said that Anatoli was asked to stay at the rear of the group to keep an eye on everybody. But Anatoli ignored this, slept late, took a shower, and departed base camp 5 hours behind the last clients. So when Dale ran into trouble, Anatoli was nowhere to be seen. And Dale says that this is where Scott laid into Anatoli for not climbing with the team. But then again, Dale wasn't the biggest fan of Anatoli. He said that Anatoli had poor social skills and didn't watch out for people. And Anatoli didn't really speak English very well. He was Kazakhstan and he spoke Russian, and his accent was very thick, so I think people had trouble understanding him, and that could have affected how he related socially to people, because some people really loved him. Dale told Scott that he didn't want to climb with Anatoli any higher on the mountain because he didn't know if you could count on him when it mattered. Meanwhile, one of Scott's team members, 68-year-old Pete Schoening, had also gone back to base camp, so that meant that 2 members of Scott's team were now out of the summit bid. So Scott rested at base camp for a while and then headed back up that icefall and ran into Henry Todd of Himalayan Guides. Henry admitted that Scott was way faster than him usually, yet they were going up at the same pace. And he asked Scott why he was down here back at base camp, and he said Scott started tearing up when he told him about Dale, and he was also coughing quite a bit. Henry said that Scott was burning himself up and that he knew Scott wasn't well. And he said Scott's parting words to him were, "I'm worried about these people, and I'm worried about the situation." Lena said Scott wasn't his usual self right from the start. He went on a huge expedition to Mount Kilimanjaro in January of 1996, and he had a very tough schedule from then until now. She said, "I was shocked at how exhausted he was. He was totally exhausted and kept getting sick. So I suggested that he really needed to rest. Maybe he had to rest for half a year because his whole life he had been pushing himself, and so far he was able to cope with it because he was very, very strong physically. And she knew that he was struggling with his personal limits. He wrote her a letter before Everest saying he had to learn to be humble because he didn't want to die in the mountains." Most people who climb Everest do it with supplemental oxygen. It helps in 2 ways. It decreases the altitude that you feel and therefore prevents or reduces the effects of severe hypoxia. And it also keeps you warm by allowing the blood to flow more freely to your extremities. The drawbacks are that it's really heavy to carry the oxygen bottles, especially when you're really tired, and flow rates need to be low so it lasts a long time. And one of the big debates is whether Anatoli should have used oxygen or not as a guide. And it seems the consensus is that most people, including Everest veterans and guides who are experts, that he should have used it because you work at your best when you have supplemental oxygen, especially when you're responsible for other people's lives. But Anatoli says that he and Scott discussed his use of oxygen and that Scott was okay with him not using it. In fact, Lopsang wasn't going to use oxygen either, and Scott, he said, was even considering not using it as well. Many people later said that Scott insisted his guides climb with oxygen, but if you believe Anatoli's account, Scott was okay with 2 guides climbing without it, and he was considering not using it himself. The climb from Camp 2 to 3 takes about 4 to 6 hours. Sherpas fix ropes all the way up the Lhotse face, and it's critical that climbers stay attached to the rope at all times. Every year, at least 1 death occurs here, and most are because a climber just failed to clip in properly. And this is where the altitude really starts to affect people. Here they're at about 7,000 meters or 23,000 feet. On the morning of May 7th, after a brief delay due to high winds, the teams headed towards Camp 3. On the way, Anatoli ran into the IMAX team who was coming down from their summit attempt. Ed Viesters, the Everest veteran who was on the IMAX team this year, told Anatoli they were coming down because they didn't like the weather, that it was too unstable, and they were going to hang back for a few days just to see if it would stabilize. They also didn't want other climbers in the background of their shots, and they thought that so many people in the same area was too risky in terms of safety. Ed said they spent a windy night at Camp 3 and saw that it was still windy up high, so they knew that it wasn't the weather window that they were looking for, so they were going to wait. Ed actually said that he felt a bit sheepish coming down because everyone else was going up. He and David were questioning their decision. Then they ran into leaders Rob and Scott, who were surprised they were heading back down. That made the IMAX team question their decision even more, but they just told them that we're going down, it just doesn't feel right. So you have to wonder, these Everest veterans were going down because of the weather, but Rob and Scott were going up. Were they experiencing summit fever, which is the compulsion to make it to the summit no matter the cost? Ed said he'd seen it before. He said if 8 climbers head up, they'll pull up 10 more climbers with them. They think so-and-so's going, so why not? We should be going too. But on Everest, like any mountain, you've got to make your own decisions. So they all gave each other a big hug. They were all friends and they all had been climbing together for years, and they said, have a great trip and stay safe. Rob told Ed that he'd see him back at base camp, to which Ed replied, I'll buy you a beer when you get back down. Ed had kept a close eye on the weather over the previous week, Every afternoon the clouds would roll up high and it was far too windy along the summit ridge to climb. That magical window of calm, clear days wasn't upon them yet. The IMAX team felt the conditions were okay, but not great. Ed said we'd be idiots to force it and go now in unsettled weather. And that's exactly when the other teams were heading up. Climbers were relieved to get to Camp 3. It was quite windy, and Lena described it as being so fierce she was being thrown off her feet and had to cling to a rock to avoid being thrown off the mountain. If this wind kept up, many assumed that their summit bid would just be off. There's no way they could climb it in this weather. It was just too miserable. As Rob's team was heading up this section, guide Andy Harris was suddenly struck in the chest by a boulder the size of a small TV. It threw him off of his feet, knocked the wind out of him, and left him dangling from the fixed lines. He wasn't hurt, but he was shocked and realized that if that boulder hit his head, he would have been killed instantly. Dangers lurking all around on Everest. At Camp 3, Scott shared a tent with Sandy and Neil. Sandy had her satellite phone here so she could call NBC from up high on the mountain. And if you've seen my other video on Sandy Hill Pittman, you'll see in the comments that this is another bone of contention with those critical of her. And the reports have said that the equipment weighed about 20 to 40 pounds that was brought up the mountain for her by Sherpas. And the equipment didn't even work past Camp 3, so it was kind of a waste of time to bring it all the way up there. Anatoli did say that she hired her own Sherpas for hauling of her gear, but on this subject, even Krakauer admits that the person who was ultimately responsible for her equipment being hauled up that high on the mountain was the leader, Scott. Sandy was able to phone in her dispatch from here and was barely able to talk because of the cough she had developed. She told them they were melting water, eating red licorice, and that the IMAX team had turned back. If she or anyone else was concerned that two of the highest regarded Everest veterans had turned back, no one mentioned it. Krakauer took note of his teammates at Camp 3. Lou was so tired that Rob was carrying his pack. Lou looked pale and distraught and said he was just finished. He was completely out of gas. Frank Fishbeck, one of the more experienced climbers who had attempted Everest 3 times and almost made it to the summit, showed up a few minutes later. He looked even more exhausted than Lou. Krakauer said it was a shock to see them like this since they'd been climbing so well. And Lou recalled how exhausted he was here, too. He said they were all suffering. He said everyone was quiet, even Beck, who had been known to be quite chatty. There were chunks of ice from the Lhotse face falling down and smashing into the tent walls, and he said, "Who would have known on May 8th that I would not sleep or even just rest again for 4 days and nights? If I had known about the nightmare I was facing, I would happily have packed up and bailed out." And he questioned why anyone would ever want to climb Mount Everest. And now they faced a decision about whether to keep going for the summit. Anatoli was concerned about the wind velocity and he didn't think they should go. He discussed this with Scott and Rob disagreed. And Scott said that he was going to follow Rob's lead. Anatoli said that in 2 decades of climbing, he'd developed a certain intuition and his feeling was that things were just not right. He said for several days the weather had not been stable. And he really wanted his feelings to be heard, but it's clear that Scott didn't listen to him, the same way that he did Rob. Scott was less experienced on Everest than Rob. This was his first time guiding clients up it, and so he may have just deferred to Rob at that point. And you can't help but think how the competition between the two affected their decision-making. As they settled in for the evening and tried to sleep before the summit bid, Rob urged them to use oxygen throughout the night. He said, "Every minute you remain at this altitude, your minds and bodies are deteriorating. Brain cells are dying. Blood is growing dangerously thick. Capillaries and retinas can hemorrhage, and oxygen would help slow this decline and help them sleep." The climb to Camp 4 is about 3 to 5 hours. It's only 365 meters or 1,200 feet of gain, and it's mostly over flat, hard-packed snow and ice, but it's approaching the death zone. The angle is suddenly steeper, and there's fixed lines, but you move slowly and carefully, trying to avoid a mistake that would leave you at the bottom of a crevasse. As they head further up, climbers are mostly on rock. The climbing so far has been on snow and ice, so they must have careful foot placement and stay focused. One slip without being clipped in could mean a 1,500 meter or 5,000 foot free fall. As they were climbing to Camp 4, unbeknownst to the two teams, the first fatal accident occurred below them. Chen Yu Nan, a 36-year-old steelworker, crawled out of his tent to go to the bathroom in only his bootliners. He quickly lost his balance and went flying down the Lhotse face into a crevasse. Luckily, his teammates saw it happen and they were able to rescue him, and he seemed okay at the time, but he was going to go down, obviously, because he was injured. Sherpas started to help him down the mountain, but he must have suffered from internal injuries because he soon lost consciousness. The IMAX team rushed up to see if they could help him, but it was too late. Lou said what makes climbing different from any other sport is the heavy punishment for one mistake. And the most common mistake is a momentary loss of concentration. And for that, Chen paid the ultimate price. Krakauer woke up that morning lethargic and groggy. He'd assumed that Lou and Frank would not continue on, but they were already up the ropes when he got there. As he joined his teammates, he looked down to see a line of approximately 50 people climbing up the single rope. He picked his pace and tried to keep ahead of the line. He was able to leapfrog past others ahead of him, but it was nerve-wracking and exhausting. Anatoli was the last to leave camp, and he also took note of the huge amount of climbers ahead. His progress was slowed as he had to maneuver around everybody. His plan was to get to Camp 4 first so he could make sure everything was ready for the clients. The death zone is at 8,000 meters or 26,246 feet, and Camp 4 is just below that. Krakauer said that once climbers get to Camp 4, they're constantly dehydrated and can no longer sleep or eat. The thought of food becomes repugnant to most people. Your body has a hard time digesting anything if you do manage to swallow something. And climbers also burn about 12,000 calories a day. Camp 4 is located on the South Col, which is a broad notch between the upper parts of Lhotse and Everest. It's rectangular in shape and is about 4 football fields long by 2 across. Each edge drops thousands of feet and meters into Tibet or Nepal. The tents are on a patch of barren ground surrounded by more than 1,000 discarded oxygen canisters. Anatoli got to Camp 4 around 2 p.m. and it was absolute pandemonium. The wind was blowing more than 100 kilometers an hour or 62 miles an hour, and it was tearing across the exposed plateau. Sherpas were struggling to set up tents, so Anatoli was helping them, and they had to scream to hear each other over the roaring wind. He said that the squall was just trying to rip them off the mountain. Lena and Martin arrived looking tired, but with no serious issues. Anatoli said Neil looked like he was starting to feel the altitude. Lena recalls that when she arrived, she was exhausted. And she found out here that Lopsang was really sick. He arrived coughing and vomiting, but he said this was normal for him at high altitude. He had arrived here carrying an 80-pound load, 30 of it which was Sandy's satellite phone and hardware. Lena pointed out how you don't think clearly at that altitude, and you believe you're rational and making the most intelligent decisions. But you can't be sure because your brain is so oxygen deprived. She mentioned how other teams, when they had to make a demanding decision, they'd radio base camp and talk to their team down there who were more capable of thinking straight. She says she wishes Scott's team had done it that way. But they had these subpar radios that didn't work very well, and they only had 2 of them. They actually only had sporadic radio communication above Camp 2, which is insane because guides need to be in contact with each other when they're spread out on the mountain. As the afternoon wore on, the winds increased exponentially. Anatoli talked to Rob about the weather, and Rob said that in his experience, it's often calm after a storm like that. He said if it clears in the night, we'll make our summit bid later. But if the weather doesn't change, we'll wait 24 hours, and if the weather's bad after that second day, we'll descend. Anatoli didn't think the weather would stabilize at all. He fully expected that they wouldn't climb later that night. Scott arrived, and Anatoli told him about the discussion with Rob, and he reiterated that he just didn't feel the conditions were good enough and that they should consider going down. But once again, Scott agreed with Rob, despite Anatoli's advice. Krakauer said the winds here can be stronger than at the summit because the wind accelerates as it squeezes through this V-shaped valley. The teams tried resting in their tents, but the flapping of the tents and anxiety about the summit bid made sleep impossible. Lou, Beck, Andy, and Doug Hansen were trying to rest in their tent, but the winds hammered them too, making it impossible to rest. And they were supposed to leave in 3 hours for the summit. Lou said there's no way we can leave in a few hours. They needed all 4 of them inside the tent to keep it down. They debated the issue in the tent, and everyone agreed that they just weren't going to make the summit bid. Lou didn't think it was a difficult decision to make because the weather was so horrible. And May 10th is their summit day. That was kind of an arbitrary number anyways. They didn't have to do it on that day. Other than it being Rob's lucky day, they really didn't have to go up that night at all. And Lou felt, like others, that there had been no precedent for stable weather up high, so it was more likely to be hostile than not. Doug was sleeping beside Beck, and Beck noticed that he was really sick and hadn't been climbing well. Doug hadn't been eating, drinking, or resting like the others. Something was off. Beck said Doug had almost become obsessed with summiting since 1995 when Rob made him turn back just before the summit. It ruled his every waking thought. And he came back to Everest this year and vowed that under no circumstance was he going to be turned around again. Beck's personal goal was only to get as far as the South Col, and he was there now, so he was pretty happy about that. He felt that if he didn't make it to the top, it was still worth it. He said the one thing you must ask yourself is how much do you have left in the tank? Can you still turn around and get back safely? It's an obligation to your fellow climbers as well as yourself. He didn't think that Doug knew this any longer or even cared. Beck was also concerned about Yasuko Namba, the 47-year-old Japanese woman. She was very small, only about 90 pounds, and he was concerned that she had to carry the same gear as everyone else, including those big oxygen tanks. Anatoli chatted with Lena and Cleb Schoening, who was the nephew of Pete, who had turned back and gone back to base camp. They all thought a summit bid just wouldn't happen that night. The climb from Camp 4 to the balcony usually takes 4 to 6 hours. Climbers leave the South Col and it's a few hundred yards to the start of the fixed ropes. From there, the route goes straight up the icy slope with angles of 30 to 50 degrees. The balcony is a spot where climbers pick up a new oxygen bottle and swap it out with an old one. Later that evening, on May 9th, the winds actually calmed, but they still hadn't seen that good, consistent weather window. Rob came to Lou's tent and told them to all be ready to climb at 11 p.m. Now, Lou wasn't okay with this plan to go, but each climber kind of had their own individual decision to make on whether to go or not. They didn't have to go. It was their own decision. Only each of them knew their own personal limits, and the level of risk they were willing to take was an individual thing. Lou wondered about that weather window. What evidence did they have that it had opened? But everyone else started getting ready, so Lou got ready too. But he had this sick feeling in his stomach that Rob made the wrong decision. As they left, Lou overheard Rob talking to base camp. He said, "We're going. All are strong, and we're going to set some world records." Yasuko would be the oldest woman to summit Everest, and Rob would be summiting for the 5th time. But those were the only records that Lou was aware of. He thought about it and wondered if Rob was really going for a record for the largest number of people from one expedition to summit on a single day. Lou felt Rob was record-oriented in that he knew the publicity value of world records. New records would help his business grow. Meanwhile, Krakauer and his teammates got ready in their tents. They were each going to be carrying 2 6.6-pound oxygen tanks, and each person would pick up the 3rd tank higher on the mountain. So Rob's team started out from Camp 4 an hour ahead of the Mountain Madness team. And now we're going to talk about the infamous short roping incident. So what is short roping, some of you may be wondering? Well, according to the Climber's Handbook, which is supposed to be the Bible of short roping, who knew that even existed? Short roping is when a guide, who is the more confident person, and a client, the less confident person, either through inexperience, injury, exhaustion, or a variety of other reasons, move together in terrain that is hazardous, joined at the rope for protection or for comfort of the client. According to Anatoli, when Scott's team was leaving Camp 4, Lopsang asked if anyone was ready, and if they were, they should go with him. Sandy stepped forward, and that's when Lopsang tied himself to Sandy. Then they started off, tied together with Lopsang leading Sandy. Krakauer and others also saw the short roping incident and said it lasted for about 4 to 5 hours. And this received a lot of criticism because people claim it slowed Lopsang down, so he couldn't fix ropes higher up on the mountain, which was one of his jobs. People actually blame the deaths on Sandy because of this single short roping incident, which is kind of crazy because you'll see soon that there's so many more factors involved in this whole tragedy. But the problem with that theory on the short roping incident misses the point that Lopsang was really sick and vomiting and wasn't able to do his normal duties. He was moving much more slowly than usual even before the short roping incident. When asked about this later, Sandy told Krakauer that she didn't want to be short roped and that it was only for about an hour or two. And that's all she's ever said on this. People asked if Scott told Lopsang to do this to make sure Sandy got to the summit because she was a high-profile client. But Lopsang said no, that he usually short-roped weaker clients just to help them out, and that was kind of normal practice for him. But ultimately, the actions of Scott's guides and his Sherpas, they were solely his responsibility. Charlotte got out of her tent at Camp 4 and emerged into a calm, cold evening. She said with their big down suits on and the oxygen mask, it was hard to tell who was who. She started off at the front of Scott's pack with Neil ahead of her. They quickly caught up to Rob's team and were pretty frustrated as they were held back and immediately slowed down. Lena left with the first part of Scott's team and she and Scott wished each other good luck and she gave him a hug before she left. Scott would be the sweep at the rear. Both him and Rob were kind of doing that with their own teams. They would be the sweeping up the clients from the back. And the whole idea was that if they came across somebody who was really struggling, they would turn them back and make them go back down. And at this point, you got to remember it was dark. It was middle of the night. It was steep and hard to see as they navigated their way in this new area which they'd never been before. They had to go across ice and there was crevasses all around them. Lena said that you had to concentrate really hard here. Just taking one step at a time, focus on the person in front of you and don't let the fear take over. There was no safety line here at the start, which surprised her because this was very exposed and risky. But then they finally got to the area where the fixed rope started and she let out a sigh of relief. She clipped in and climbed upwards. Even with oxygen, she said it was madly exhausting. She caught up with Lopsang, who was coughing and ill, and was kind of surprised that nobody did anything about it. He just kept climbing. She didn't mention anything about him short-roping Sandy at that time, so I'm not sure if he was here and she just didn't mention it, or if he wasn't short-roping her anymore. They all progressed at a snail's pace. The fixed ropes then came to an end, and Lena was terrified. She was scared of falling and also continuously wondering how she was going to get back down again. They got to a spot where the snow was so deep that they sank in up to their hips in several places, so it gives you an idea of how difficult this was. All she could think was just, if there was an avalanche, it would all be over. She could see the mountain ranges all over Nepal and said it was a beautiful sight, but it was terrifying. She was profoundly conscious of being in the death zone, and she fully understood at that moment how people die up there. There is zero margin for error. And within 2 or 3 hours of leaving, both teams and the Taiwanese now were all mixed together. No one knew the Taiwanese team was going to be summiting that day, but they likely wanted to climb in behind the stronger teams who were breaking trail and fixing ropes. A few hours later, Lou saw Frank and Rob in deep conversation, and then Frank started turning around. He decided to turn back. Now, Frank was a strong climber with a lot of experience, and he was also an independent thinker. Frank had also been vocal earlier about not climbing because of the weather. But at that moment, Lou had no reason to turn around himself. He was just absolutely determined to get to the top. And not long after that, Doug passed Lou heading down the mountain as well. He said that he felt really bad and was very cold. His feet were now more sensitive to the cold since he froze them in 1995, so they were really bothering him. Lou said that Frank and Doug at that moment were making that individual hard decision that Rob expected from each of them. And Doug hadn't acclimatized as well as the rest of them. But he seemed to improve back at base camp, so that's why he was allowed to keep climbing. Other people raised concern about Doug's ability to go to the summit without having slept at Camp 3. But Rob said he wasn't concerned because of how Doug performed in 1995. And this made absolutely no sense to Lou because that was a year ago, and even then Doug had issues just before the summit. And Doug looked awful as far back as Camp 3. Now on summit day, Doug was doing the best thing for himself based on his own judgment, and that was to turn around. Krakauer, Rob Sherpa Ang Dorje, and guide Mike Groom were leading in the hours before dawn. At several places they had come to a stop because Rob instructed them not to put any more than 100 meters or 328 feet between them until they reached the balcony. Krakauer was frustrated by this. He wasn't used to climbing in a team where their speeds were so varied and he had to slow down and stop and wait for people. But he had no choice, so they sat and waited. But sitting and waiting means not moving, and that means getting cold and using up valuable oxygen doing nothing. Meanwhile, Beck was motoring along doing pretty good and climbing right behind Ang, Mike, and Krakauer. He gradually realized, though, that he couldn't see very well. After being nearsighted for years, Beck had finally had surgery a year and a half earlier so he could see better in the mountains. But, he said, unbeknownst to him and virtually every other ophthalmologist in the world, at high altitude, the cornea will both flatten and thicken, making you blind. He didn't think it was that bad at the time because he could still sort of see, but not great, and he had no depth perception, but he thought it would improve as the sun came up because he always had trouble seeing in the dark. He didn't tell anybody, but he was too blind to climb, so he stepped out of line and let everyone pass, going from the fourth climber to dead last. And he looked back on it and he said it wasn't unpleasant and that I basically stood there like a Walmart greeter until the sun came up. He was at the balcony when Rob came up behind him. Beck told him that they could go ahead and he'd wander up after them. It was about 7:30 a.m. Rob didn't like that idea. He said that Beck had 30 minutes and if he could climb by then, he could climb on, but if he still couldn't see in 30 minutes, that there would be no more climbing for him. And Beck accepted that. Beck said if his vision improved, he'd just head back down to Camp 4, and Rob said no to that idea. According to Beck, Rob explicitly told him to stay there and wait because Rob wouldn't know when he came back down if Beck had made it back to camp safely or if he went flying off the mountain. So Beck agreed and said that he'd stay there and wait. It never entered his mind that Rob may never return. Lou climbed by Beck, and Beck told him what happened, and Lou said he just looked at him and felt nothing for Beck. He says the climb is so physically and mentally difficult and so intense that you only focus on yourself. It overrides everything else. And that's a really fascinating tidbit because people wonder why climbers just walk past injured people or dead bodies, and this is partly why. Lou said when you're suffering from fatigue, malnutrition, dehydration, hypoxia, and sleep deprivation, you don't have much emotional capacity, let alone empathy. But as he looked back on it later, Lou realized that Beck needed help immediately, and there were resources available to help him. He said Rob had a leadership dilemma. Leaving Beck at the balcony meant Rob had all of his guides and Sherpas fully supporting the people going to the summit. But that delayed getting Beck down to safety. Lou felt that if Rob sent Mike or Andy back to short rope Beck down to Camp 4, that would mean less leaders helping people to the summit. That also meant that Mike or Andy wouldn't be able to summit, and Andy had never summited Everest before. And he said their Sherpas were only there to help with logistics. They weren't there to help clients. So Rob decided to handle Beck's problem later, and didn't foresee problems or delays up ahead. Lou cites one of the unwritten rules of mountaineering, and that's to not leave a sick or injured climber alone. Plus, another reason it made no sense is that Beck would be out of oxygen before somebody saw him again. Without generating body heat by not moving, and no oxygen meant it would be very difficult for him to stay warm. Lou felt that Rob just simply made the wrong decision. But Lou kept climbing because he was actually enjoying the moment now. He said he snapped some photos and headed up to follow the others, but didn't realize that his nightmare was about to begin. Krakauer got to the balcony at 5:30 a.m. and Anatoli arrived at about 6 a.m. They were more than an hour in front of the rest of Rob's group, and he had told his whole team to wait here for each other. So that's another hour of wasted time, energy, and delay for the climbers in front. Lou got to the balcony and was somewhat surprised to see Doug there. Doug obviously changed his mind about going back down. Scott's team arrived and they continued climbing shortly after arriving to get ahead of Rob's team. And it was really important here to spread out because after the balcony, passing would be difficult and dangerous. Lou changed his oxygen and noticed his fingers were white. They were very difficult to move and very cold. He thought he had frostbite, but at that point, he didn't even care. He just kept on going. Charlotte says that after they left the balcony, it was like a conga line. It was one step up, then 2 steps back in the 4 inches of snow on top of the loose, down-sloping shale. The water they were carrying was beginning to freeze, even though it was in insulated sleeves within their down jackets, so it was very, very cold. The route narrowed from the previous rock and snow face to a ridge toward the summit. Charlotte said the top looked so close, but it was still hours away. The line moved on but slowed again as they arrived at sections needing new fixed rope. The next stretch is from the balcony to the south summit, and that takes about 3 to 4 hours. Here it gets steeper and can be rocky if the wind has blown away fresh snow. And keep in mind that climbers have their crampons on, which dig into the snow, and so it's more difficult to walk on rock than it is on snow and ice. And this is usually the area where the weather can turn really bad. By this time, the sun was starting to come up, and climbers have been out for about 8 to 10 hours. Lena says they got to the southeast ridge and it was bright sunshine. She noticed that Anatoli looked cold and assumed it was because he wasn't using oxygen because she felt pretty warm. She was happy to be past Rob's team because of their slower speed, and she felt starting behind Rob's team and mingling with them on the fixed ropes probably cost him a couple of hours. When Rob's team started up, Lou was in the middle and Rob was at the back again. And this is when Lou realized that he had an issue with his eye protection. The oxygen mask kept moving his sunglasses, so the bottom of his lenses were just off of his face enough so that he could see the snow below the glass frame. This wasn't good because that meant the sun was reflecting off the snow and into his eyes. And up here at this altitude, the thinner air provides less protection from UV rays. Sunburning the cornea happens, and that results in snow blindness, which is a temporary kind of blindness. And Lou was also having issues with his oxygen. He didn't feel like it was working at all. But he didn't want to stop and fix either of those things because he didn't want to slow other people down. And at this point, he admits that he has full-on summit fever. Nothing was going to stop him from going up. Now we're going to talk about the rope fiasco. So let's briefly go back to base camp where Scott, Rob, and their guides met about the rope situation and tried to figure out who would install the ropes up high. And it was decided then that the Sherpas Ang and Lopsang would leave Camp 4 a couple hours ahead of the main group to fix those ropes. This would give them enough time to install the ropes on the most exposed section before the clients arrived, so there wouldn't be those lineups. The 2 points that needed the ropes were the ridge traverse from the south summit to the Hillary Step, and then on the 40-foot section of the step itself. For some reason, though, no Sherpas headed out in front of the group that night. After the expedition, Lopsang said that Rob and Scott scrapped the plan later because they received information that a previous team who attempted the summit had already completed the job. Krakauer, however, he didn't buy this. He says that if that happened, Mike, Neil, and Anatoli were never told about the change of plans. Plus, the Sherpas brought extra ropes, so he questioned why they would bring ropes if they didn't need it. But then again, one could argue, and Ed Viesters did, he said that it's not uncommon to bring extra rope just in case you need it. Lou said in the previous several days, at least 3 teams had made unsuccessful attempts at the summit, and one team climbed all the way to the Hillary Step before turning back, so ropes only needed to be fixed at the step. Lou needed to stop and take a break, so he sat down and had a rest, and that's when he saw Rob coming up. He said Rob was shaking and he looked really cold, and he wasn't his normal, strong self. The south summit to the actual summit is about 1 to 2 hours. And the ridge from the south summit to the Hillary Step is one of the most exposed and dangerous sections of the climb. The narrow ridge drops thousands of feet on either side, and it's only the size of a sidewalk. At 10 a.m., Neil made it to the south summit and was followed 30 minutes later by Martin. And this is where there was another big delay because more ropes were needed here. Martin said that he and Neil waited there for almost 2 hours. And now there was this huge jam of people waiting. Rob's clients were mixed in with Scott's, and the faster clients couldn't pass here. And Martin was frustrated not moving. He was well aware that he was using up precious oxygen, waiting. When Anatoli got there, he saw Martin, Neil, Ang, Tim, Mike, and a few others, but no one was moving. He said it seemed like they had no desire to move ahead. Everyone's strength was diminishing, so nobody was really keen to keep on going. Anatoli began to wonder where Scott was and said that he thought the clients might have to be turned around here, but there was no Scott to do it. Anatoli and Neil both felt that they didn't have the right to turn people around, and the only ones at the radios were Scott and Lopsang, neither of which were here. Krakauer arrived here to find a worse lineup than the last one. He sat down with Andy, Neil, and Anatoli to wait for the Sherpas to fix ropes along this ridge. Krakauer admitted he was now in a hypoxia stupor and completely lost track of time. He said none of them paid attention to the Sherpas from Rob's team sitting beside them, sharing a thermos of tea, with no interest or hurry to keep going. Around 11:40, Neil asked the Sherpas if they were going to fix the ropes, and they said no. Krakauer thought it was maybe because of Scott's Sherpas who were not there to share the work. And then as the crowd grew, Neil finally suggested that he, Andy, and Anatoli fix the ropes. And Lou had something to say about this rope situation. He felt that the guides had a clear and simple choice on what to do. The best choice was to continue climbing without fixing new rope on this short ridge traverse to the Hillary Step. Lou felt that no rope was needed, and he said they all knew that in previous years people climbed this section without it. It was exposed, but it was straightforward and not difficult. If they really wanted a new rope, the only choice was to set it themselves. They had the extra rope, and the work to fix it was not difficult or time-consuming. The other choice was to not continue climbing and just sit there and wait for Sherpas to do the work for them. And Lou says that's what they did. They sat on their butts and waited. Minutes ticked by, then hours. Then finally 2 hours were lost. Doing nothing, burning daylight, one of the most precious and critical resources on summit day. Krakauer was sitting there with 3 professional guides, and they lost track of time waiting for the Sherpas to fix ropes. Lou wondered why no one had a sense of leadership in that moment. Waiting is never part of the plan at that altitude. There were now 28 climbers piled together at the south summit. Mike was there for the entire 2 hours and said Rob had given him instructions not to get involved with the ropes. Before noon, he tried calling Rob on the radio, but he couldn't get through. Lou said this came down to Rob's leadership being a one-man band. He said the climbers' inaction and decision to wait was much more consequential to the outcome than the Sherpas' failure to set ropes. Lou was convinced that Lopsang was slowed down by altitude sickness and that it was ridiculous for the other climbers, including guides, to sit and wait for him to come and fix the ropes. For one Sherpa. If they had fixed it for themselves right away, they would have stayed spread out all the way to the summit and back. And the new rope that everyone was waiting for never was fixed. All Anatoli did was reach down and pull up an old rope that was buried in the snow. It took minutes. All the waiting was for nothing. Lena corroborates using these old ropes and said that expeditions had the best intentions to put up their own ropes here, but at this point, you don't care as long as there's something to grab onto. I would be requesting a brand spanking new rope. Lena said that she came to a standstill for what seemed like hours, almost nodding off while hanging onto the rope before they got moving again. As Lou was waiting in line at the south summit, he saw John Taskey coming down. Then another teammate, Stu, started coming down as well. These were 2 of the team's strongest and smartest climbers. Stu said that it's just too late, there's too many people, and I need to go down now or get caught out. And being caught out means being caught out in the open after dark, which is a climber's worst fear at that altitude. This hit Lou pretty hard because he respected these guys, but he told Stu that he just wasn't ready to turn around yet. Stu and John Taskey, they were tough, ambitious climbers that Lou respected, and neither would go down so close to the summit without important reasons behind that decision. But Lou said that he didn't even want to think about turning around then. He was programmed for 6 weeks straight to get to the summit. And he asked a Sherpa how much longer, and the Sherpa told him 2 hours, and that was way longer than Lou thought. It was now close to noon, and they'd been climbing for 13 hours. And they were behind schedule. They were very, very late. Lou did the math in his head. 2 more hours to get to the top would be 2 p.m., plus 6 hours back. In ideal conditions, that puts them at Camp 4 at 8 p.m., way too late and in the dark. Based on Rob's summit plan, it was now too late. They were out of time, but others were still going up, so Rob must think it's okay, Lou thought. So he thought, I guess I can do this too. Lou felt physically and mentally wasted, yet he kept going. He said, in climbing, the only thing worse than not making the summit is when others do and you don't. Then something frightening happened to Lou. His heart started to race and pound. It seemed like it was out of control. He had no idea what was happening, and he suddenly dropped to his knees. Instantly, he had this new, wider perspective. He knew that he could make it to the summit, but he wasn't sure he'd get back down now. Looking up, things were looking okay, but below him, visibility was poor and the wind was getting stronger. Lou felt the weather was changing and not for the better. His only thought was, I should turn around now. Others are counting on me to stick to the turnaround time. And he also promised his wife that he would only live a story that he could tell. Climbers kept passing him, heading up the mountain, oblivious to the danger, but no one said a word. There was more pressure to keep going, but Lou knew he had to make a hard choice right now. And then all of a sudden, everything got very quiet. He knew at that moment that he had to turn around. So he did just that. And the second he turned around and took his first step downhill, his heart stopped pounding. He felt at peace and knew instantly that he made the right choice. 5 out of 8 clients on Rob's team made this really hard decision on their own. Before noon, Mike was at the South Summit with Yasuko. He didn't want to continue unless he talked to Rob because he was concerned, like Lou, that it was too late to continue. Rob got to the South Summit at noon and looked around. Everything was at stake now, and what Rob did next, Lou believes, is the 1996 Everest story. Rob's team continued on. The Hillary Step is a near vertical rock face around 12 meters or 40 feet high. After 12 hours of climbing, it's a huge challenge for climbers, physically and psychologically, and it's a common turnaround point for climbers. There are so many fixed ropes that it can get confusing on which is which. Ropes from previous years are rarely removed, and they're frozen and brittle and shouldn't be used. And only one climber at a time should be climbing here. Anatoli went up first, tying on to existing anchors placed by earlier expeditions and setting the rope. Neil came up after him, followed by Andy and Krakauer. Anatoli went ahead to lead and break trail while Neil finished fixing the ropes. Krakauer was increasingly worried about his oxygen supply and asked Neil if he could hurry ahead to the summit and leave the fixing of ropes to him. Neil agreed, and Martin ended up helping him. Climbers were now all bunched together because of all the waiting. Mike discussed the weather when Rob got there, and the winds were increasing and clouds were starting to develop below. Rob said that it'll be alright provided it doesn't get worse, which doesn't sound very reassuring. According to Lou, Rob and Doug were here in 1993 when there was a long delay of only 6 climbers in front of them. If 6 were significant for a delay, what about 28? And on that day in 1993, a record number of 40 climbers made it to the summit. But the critical difference was that climbers started reaching the summit at 9:30 a.m. and finished by 1 p.m. Now teams had no chance of reaching the summit by 2 p.m. at this rate, and everyone's oxygen was getting low. They might not have enough to get back to Camp 4. And the crazy coincidence is that Rob faced this exact decision at the same time on the exact same day 1 year earlier. At 12:30 p.m. on the same day in 1995, Rob's team was at the South Summit with no other climbers above or below. They faced no delays or weather issues, but they were behind schedule. They were simply out of time. Rob stuck with the turnaround time and turned back. But last year, there was no pressure of a rider on the team or competition from another team. So this year, Rob kept going, with Mike, Doug, and Yasuko following him. Lou said if Rob's team was unable to reach the summit 2 years in a row, that would have major impacts on his business, especially if Scott's team reached the summit. Lou says some of the strongest voices were spoken when the strongest, most experienced climbers turned around. And the strongest and loudest voice was that of Beck, who was still standing alone and waiting at the balcony. Charlotte talks about huffing and puffing up the Hillary step and says it was strenuous but not that difficult, which is hilarious because they've been climbing for 13 hours and they've been doing this for weeks on end, and for her not to find it difficult is just amazing. But once they got past that, they emerged onto this broad, slanted summit ridge, and there it was, the summit. Anatoli got to the summit at 1:07 p.m. with more a sense of relief than celebration. And while it was considerably later than he would have liked to have arrived, he thought that if the clients followed quickly, they'd all be able to make it up soon. Krakauer was second, and he got there at 1:12 p.m., finally obtaining a goal he'd had since childhood. But he knew the summit was only the halfway point. He said, "Any impulse I had towards self-congratulating myself was extinguished by the overwhelming apprehension about the long, dangerous descent." Martin noticed that Neil seemed like he was moving a little slow, and he asked Martin to turn up his oxygen bottle. When they were almost to the summit, he asked him to turn up even more, and Martin just cranked it up all the way. About 1:25, Martin and Neil made it to the summit. At 1:45 p.m., Clev made it to the summit, and Anatoli took his photo. After his arrival, the traffic to the summit stopped, and by 2 p.m., no more climbers had arrived. Anatoli was starting to become concerned. He said that everyone on the team that he saw on the summit looked good and was in no danger, and he had no concern about them. But he began to wonder where everybody else was. And right at this time, the IMAX team was back at Camp 2. They'd been monitoring the progress at the summit through a telescope, and they could see climbers still going up at 2 p.m. Ed said, "We just saw them standing there and moving very slow. And we could see streamer clouds going over the top, and I'm going, God, it's way too late. They're really pushing it. Not only was it late, but you only have 18 hours of oxygen." So they called down to Rob's base camp and asked what the turnaround time was, and they told them 2 p.m. But 2 o'clock had come and gone. Henry Todd, with another expedition also at Camp 2, he knew about the psychology that they must have been experiencing. He said that you're absolutely knackered at that point. You stop being logical and think you can hack it. Martin knew he was running out of oxygen, so he didn't hang around on the summit for very long. As he started to descend, he passed Charlotte, Lena, Sandy, and Tim and 4 Mountain Madness Sherpas, including Lopsang. Anatoli was on the summit for about an hour. Neither he or Neil had a radio, so they had no idea what was going on below. Anatoli thought there might be trouble at the Hillary steps, so he felt that he should go down to see what was going on. And he ran into Rob on the way down, so he asked Rob if he needed any help, and Rob said no and thanked him for his work on the rope. Then Anatoli saw the Mountain Madness climbers coming up, and he realized they'd been climbing 14 hours on 18 hours of oxygen if they were using it properly. They were still 30 minutes away from the summit and would not make it back down on that last oxygen bottle. Meanwhile, Neil was on the summit and very nervous and anxious. He wanted to leave much earlier, but every time he got up to go, another wave of people came up the mountain. He didn't feel it was right to leave until everyone had reached the summit. And finally, between 2:15 and 2:30, the Mountain Madness clients made it to the summit. It was the most challenging part of the day for Sandy, as the last of her oxygen drained from her 3rd bottle. Lopsang gave her an extra bottle that he had for emergencies. Charlotte was elated. The never-ending ridge finally ended, and she was on the summit. A stiff wind was blowing, but the sky was blue, and she also felt more relief than elation, and also a deep fear. She realized that this was not a place meant for humans. She checked her watch, and it was 2:15. Anatoli said Scott had not turned back any clients because he never made contact with any of them after he last saw Lena earlier that day. By now, there were no more climbers to sweep, no place for them to go but down. But no one moved off the summit until 3:10 p.m. There were 40 minutes of celebration, picture taking, tears, and congratulations. That's 40 minutes less oxygen and 40 minutes less daylight. Anatoli ran into Scott around 2:30 while Scott was resting after climbing the Hillary step. Scott said he was really tired and that the ascent had been difficult. Anatoli felt that in that moment, the most logical thing for him to do was to descend to Camp 4 as quickly as possible and to stand by in case the climbers needed to be resupplied with oxygen. He would also prepare hot tea and warm drinks. He also said that he'd have a clear view from Camp 4 of the climbing route so he could observe developing problems with the climbers. He says Scott agreed to this plan at the time, and neither had any cause for concern about the weather. And the people on the summit thought the same thing. They said that there was a strong wind, but it really didn't intensify or wasn't getting worse. However, Lena, she saw something disturbing. She said before she went up the steps, she noticed a whiteout coming from the valleys below and saw the wind pick up over the summit. And that was a bad sign. So they started the descent. And this is when Charlotte first noticed clouds blowing up from below. They'd seen this pattern regularly in the last month. The clouds would rise up in the afternoon and roll up towards the icefall. And these clouds did look a little more black and menacing, but Charlotte thought at least we're heading back down to safety. They were actually heading into their worst nightmare. To make this a little bit easier to understand, I'm going to try and connect this to a timeline so you have a general idea of where people were at all times on the mountain. Now, it may not be completely accurate because some people have differing times for the same event and who knows what's right, but I tried to go with the general consensus on all the times. So, as you may recall from part 2, journalist John Krakauer was a second to summit at 1:12 p.m., just ahead of guide Anatoli Bukriv. Krakauer took some photos and he turned to descend around 1:30 p.m. His oxygen was limited and he thought that he better get back down fast. It was then that he noticed some wispy clouds filling the valleys below. Martin Adams was on Scott Fisher's team and he was also a pilot. He later told Krakauer that when he sees those specific types of clouds in a plane, his first reaction is to get the heck out of there. And that's what he did. Krakauer, however, had no idea that a storm was heading towards them, nor did anyone else. Lukashevsky finally turned around and accepted that he would not make the summit at all. From his experience, though, he knew that the descent was the toughest part of any climb. Accidents are more common coming down because you just have so many more things working against you. You've already summited, so that excitement is gone. There's fatigue, more dehydration, energy depletion, and hypoxia. Krakauer got to the top of the Hillary step when he ran into Andy Harris, a guide for Rob Hall's team. He asked Andy to turn off of his regulator so that he could preserve his remaining oxygen while he waited, because there were climbers coming up the step and people couldn't go down at the same time. According to Krakauer, Andy, who was experiencing the effects of the altitude, accidentally turned his oxygen all the way up. 10 minutes later, all of Krakauer's oxygen was gone, and he felt like he'd instantly been hit with a powerful sedative. As Krakauer descended, he saw Sandy Hill Pittman, Charlotte Fox, Scott's head Sherpa Lopsang Jangbu, Yasuko Namba from Rob Hall's team, and Tim Madsen. Tim was also helping Yasuko at this point as she was struggling getting up to the summit. And then Rob came up and he told Krakauer that he was disappointed that 5 of his 8 clients had turned back. All of Scott Fisher's clients were still heading up and Rob knew it. He told Krakauer, "I only wish I could have gotten more clients to the top," before he headed on his way. A little while later, Martin got to the base of the Hillary step and he noticed someone slumped in the snow. It was Krakauer, and Martin said that he was laid out, hanging onto his ice axe. The handle was driven into the snow and he wasn't clipped onto a fixed rope. Martin was wondering what they should do for him. And then Anatoli came up behind and urged Martin to keep going. He didn't want him to be delayed. Clev Schoening of Scott's team came down soon after and noticed Krakauer in distress, and that slowed the rest of the team up. So all the talk from Krakauer about other climbers being inexperienced or holding people up, well, he was also causing delays. Clev said there was nothing I could really do to help him, and I don't think I had the wherewithal to do that anyways. But I stayed there until I saw some action being taken. And that's when adventure consultant guide Mike Groom came along and stepped in to help Krakauer. He gave him his oxygen, which Clev describes as a totally selfless action. So Anatoli's now in front of the group of people he's heading down on his own. And he gets a lot of crap for leaving his clients at this point. But I'll tell you everyone's perspective and you can decide whether that was irresponsible or not. Anatoli said Scott agreed to this plan, but many others saw it as Anatoli having to head back down because he wasn't using oxygen, so he was more exhausted and more cold than the others. And some people argue that Scott Fisher wanted Anatoli to use oxygen and that they had big fights about it. But interestingly, Scott gave an interview to Outside magazine on March 31st, 1996, so before this expedition. And he said, quote, "I think that there are a couple people who are hoping to be able to climb without oxygen. Anatoli, I know, will not be using oxygen. Anatoli is an animal, a monster. That's great, but there will be oxygen for him on the South Col." And there was oxygen for Anatoli there if he needed it, and he also carried his own bottle on the way up. When Anatoli got to the balcony, he was surprised to find Beck Weathers there. Beck asked where Rob was, and Anatoli said he was a couple hours behind him. At that point, Anatoli says he was worried about Beck and also for his clients. He said Beck was like frozen. He was barely able to talk to me. Then Anatoli says he looked up and saw someone coming down, and he thought it was Andy, one of the guides, so he could help Beck down. So Anatoli continued his descent. Beck, though, he said he was just starting to lose it at this point. Although he'd been breathing oxygen, and he wasn't hypoxic, he was standing for way too long in the cold. It had been about 6 hours of standing in the same spot. And this is a type of cold that their water is freezing while it's in their down suits next to their bodies. And the cold was wreaking havoc on his mind. He was hallucinating seeing people. Higher up at the south summit, Krakauer got to the oxygen cache and saw Andy Harris, Rob's guide. He was sorting through a pile of oxygen bottles. So Krakauer asked Andy if he could get a fresh bottle, and Andy said there's no oxygen, they're all empty, which was a shock to everybody because there were supposed to be a bunch of full bottles there. And there actually were 6 full bottles, but Andy mistakenly thought they were empty. The only way to tell how much was in each was to attach a regulator and read the gauge. And this is likely how Andy checked the bottles, but if his regulator had some ice in it, the gauge may have read incorrectly. And if his regulator was acting up, that would explain his bizarre behavior. He simply wasn't getting enough oxygen. But at the time, this never entered Krakauer's mind because he said he was so messed up himself. Around 2:15 p.m., Lou climbed down to the balcony and couldn't believe what he saw. He was shocked to find his tent mate Beck there. John Taskey and Lou were climbing together, and they told Beck to come down with them, saying that they'd help him get down. But there was only one problem. They didn't have a rope, and Beck needed to be short-roped because he was so blind he couldn't see where he was going. And then Beck told him that he was going to stay. He wanted to honor his promise of waiting for Rob. Meanwhile, Neil Beidelman, Scott Fisher's guide, and their clients began to descend from the summit around 3:10 p.m. They had spent around 40 minutes on the summit, which is a lot, especially at that time of day, because they only summited around 2:30. Rob was also on the summit, and he radioed base camp and told them that it was cold and windy, and base camp said that he sounded good. He told them he made it up with Yasuko and said Doug was coming up shortly after. And after that, they'd be heading down right away. He also said, if you don't hear from me again, it means everything is fine. Back down at the south summit, Krakauer left around 3:30. He started descending into the dense layer of clouds, and it started to snow. He said it was very hard to tell where the mountain ended and the sky began. He thought it would really be easy to wander right off the edge of the mountain right now. He stopped with Mike on the southeast ridge. Mike was waiting for Yasuko, and Mike tried to call Rob on the radio, but the radios were only working intermittently. Yasuko arrived, and Krakauer asked Mike if he could continue down alone, and Mike said yes. Neil and his clients got below the south summit, and Charlotte thought that they were making pretty good time, when all of a sudden Sandy Hill, who was just behind her, went from tired and slow to a dead stop. Charlotte said, I could tell that she had acute mountain sickness, and she was not moving very well and not speaking very well, basically very confused, which was a sign of cerebral edema. Sandy was so exhausted and told Charlotte just to leave her, but Charlotte wasn't having any of that because they had bonded over this, time that they'd spent together, and she encouraged her to find the strength to keep going. Sandy tried and struggled but collapsed. And then she told Charlotte to get the hypodermic. Charlotte forgot that the expedition doctor gave everyone on Scott's team a shot of dexamethasone, a steroid effective in reducing cerebral edema, which was a last-ditch chance at survival. In the documentary Storm Over Everest, they joke about how Charlotte got this maniacal grin on her face before she jabbed Sandy in the butt with the needle. Charlotte said, Sandy rolled over, I unzipped the rainbow zipper on her down suit, and though I'd never given a shot before, I jammed that baby into the big muscle over her butt as the doctor taught us. 5 minutes later, Sandy recovered enough to continue descending. Lower down the mountain, Lou was descending behind John Taskey, and all of a sudden the snow gave way under Taskey and he went flying down the mountain. He was on his back, face up with his feet below him, just racing downhill, and Lou's heart dropped. And then Taskey, who had a lot of experience climbing, brought his ice axe across his chest and then rolled over and dug the axe into the snow. And he came to a stop. Lou said it was a textbook self-arrest, which likely saved Taskey's life. Lou noticed they were heading into a different weather system now, and it was a bad one. New snow covered the footsteps that were made during the ascent, and they could hardly find the route. They had to really concentrate hard on each step. And at one point, Taskey needed help with his backpack, so Lou stopped to take his big expedition gloves off to help him, when all of a sudden these rocks came tumbling down from above, raining on them. Lou's first concern was getting killed from a falling rock, and then the rock hit his gloves on the ground and he saw them go flying down the mountain. Someone was climbing from above them and knocking the rocks loose, and it was Anatoli, who appeared shortly after and was moving really fast, and he just flew by them. Lou did have backup gloves in his backpack, but they were also difficult to work with on the fixed ropes, so he just kept going. Taskey tried to offer him his gloves because he felt it was his fault, but Lou just said, let's just keep going. He wanted to keep moving. Not long after Sandy got the shot of Dex, the others noticed that her oxygen bottle was almost empty. Lena said, I know at this point this is dead serious. The worst thing is happening. I know that I'm the strongest, so I have to give her my oxygen, which is basically very stupid because you can have two people who are out of it. But we were a team and she was in trouble, and that's just the way it is. Meanwhile, Scott Fisher radioed base camp from the summit at 3:45 when he got there, and they told him to get down right away. All he said to them was, God, I'm tired. Makalu Gao from the Taiwanese team arrived right after Scott with two of his Sherpas, and Rob was still waiting for Doug at the summit. Basecamp spoke with Lopsang, who was with Scott, and they agreed to talk again at 6 p.m. But within 30 minutes, things changed dramatically. Lopsang recalls Scott telling him that, I'm too tired, I am sick, and that he needed medicine for his stomach. Lopsang gave him some tea, but he only drank a bit, while Lopsang just kept encouraging him to keep going. He knew they had to get down fast, because they were very high on the mountain, very late. Scott started descending around 3:55, and although he had 3/4 of a tank of oxygen, he kept taking his mask off, and Lopsang kept putting it back on him. The Taiwanese team then left the summit and left Rob alone waiting for Doug. Doug finally got to the summit at 4 p.m., 2 hours after the cutoff turnaround time, and Rob waited for him up on the summit for an hour and a half. It took Doug that long to climb a section that took most climbers 15 minutes to climb. And Lou weighed in on this. He said Doug obviously couldn't keep pace with the other climbers, and that should have put Rob on high alert that Doug was in trouble. He figured that by 4 p.m., Doug was probably without oxygen for about 3 hours. At 4:30 p.m., and again at 4:41, Rob called base camp to say he and Doug were in trouble. They urgently needed oxygen. 2 full bottles were waiting for them at the south summit, and if Rob had known this, he could have quickly gotten some of that oxygen and climbed back up to Doug to give it to him. But Andy Harris, who was still confused about the oxygen there, heard Rob talking about it on the radio and broke in to say that the bottles were empty. Mike heard this and knew Andy was wrong, so he tried getting on the radio and telling Rob that the bottles were full, but his radio kept malfunctioning. He kept trying, and he did get through a couple of times, but Andy kept interrupting him, saying that the bottles were empty. It was super frustrating. And for some reason, Rob thought the best decision was to remain with Doug. They got to the Hillary Step, and that's where they ground to a halt. There was no way Doug could navigate the 40-foot vertical drop. Rob told base camp, I can get myself down, I just don't know how I can get him down without any oxygen. And at that point, Andy was finally convinced that there was oxygen at the south summit, so he pleaded with Lopsang, who was there now, to help him carry it up to Rob. Lopsang said that he offered to pay me $500 to bring oxygen up, but I'm supposed to take care of just my group. I have to take care of Scott, so I said no to Andy. And the last Lopsang saw of Andy was Andy heading up to help Rob. According to Lou, Rob now had two hard choices. One choice was to keep going down and leave Doug behind to die, but save himself. And that would be a big challenge with daylight waning. With that choice, Rob would face harsh criticism as a professional climber and expedition leader. The other choice was to stay with Doug and try to get him moving, and then just hope for a miracle to get him down the Hillary step in the dark and another 3,000 feet down before freezing to death. Lou felt Rob was condemned either way, and he had to make a decision. Mike told a story about a leadership meeting at base camp. Rob had told Mike that if a climber dies under your leadership, you might as well be dead. So that makes you wonder how much that factored into the horrible decision that he had to make. Neither of them was great. Base camp tried to get oxygen to Rob, but the Sherpas at Camp 4 said the weather was too bad to go up. Lopsang and Scott were just below the south summit at this time, and they were out of oxygen. And now Scott was even weaker. Krakauer got to the balcony around 4:45, and he also, like everyone else, was shocked to see Beck standing there and frozen. By this time, he was shivering violently, and he had been standing there for an agonizing 10 hours by now. Beck talks about this moment where Krakauer came by, and he told him that Rob was still 3 hours behind him. He said Krakauer did offer to help him down, but Beck declined his offer. And he said that Krakauer had a sense of relief or gratitude when he declined. And in Krakauer's book, he says that he also offered Beck help, but he knew that Beck needed to be short-roped and he didn't have any rope. But then Beck said something very different in an interview, not in his book. In the interview, he said, and I quote, John says, "Beck, what are you doing here?" And I tell him my sad little tale. And I said, "John, I don't think I can wait any longer. I think Rob's going to have to understand, but it's starting to go south on us, and I'm going to need somebody to act as my eyes. And it's not a big deal. We'll just go a bit slow." And John was clearly not happy with this idea. His body language and his first reaction was to say, "Beck, I'm not a guide." I said, "I know that, John, but I can't see well enough to not walk off this thing." In all credit to John, I have no doubt that had I pushed the point with him, he would have done it. But he told me at the same time, Mike is 20 minutes behind. He has a radio. And I said, "No problem. I'll wait for Mike." At 5 p.m., Rob was with Doug above the Hillary step still, and Lopsang stayed with Scott just above the balcony, where Scott was in trouble. According to Lopsang, Scott just kept telling him how sick he was. And then he said, "Lopsang, I am dead." Anatoli was now back at Camp 4 and unaware of all of this going on above him, but he also knew that most of his clients would soon be out of oxygen. We're now going to touch on a little bit of what sparked that ongoing feud between Krakauer and Anatoli. Krakauer was highly critical of Anatoli and basically everything he did, especially his decision to head down the mountain, well ahead of his clients. He said by 5 p.m., while his teammates were still struggling down through the clouds at 28,000 feet, Anatoli was already in his tent, resting and drinking tea. Krakauer claims that Anatoli headed back down because he was cold, and that was because he wasn't using oxygen. He also maintained that it didn't make sense to leave clients on the mountain, even if the storm hadn't materialized yet. Anatoli, though, usually climbed without oxygen and said for him it's better to go with no oxygen than to use it and then it suddenly go out on him. The effect on someone after that happens can be instant. He also felt that he'd be more useful if he returned to camp in case he needed to take oxygen back up to clients or go up and help later. Krakauer argued that Anatoli racing ahead of the clients was his pattern throughout the entire expedition. And while that is partly true, Anatoli maintains that Scott agreed to that most of the time. And it also seems that Anatoli just had a guiding style that wasn't really compatible with the way Scott ran his team. Anatoli didn't want to handhold or coddle clients. He was definitely not that kind of guide. He expected them to be able to climb on their own, which is reasonable when you're on frickin' Mount Everest. But why they didn't figure out these details well ahead of the climb, who knows? I also don't believe everything Krakauer says about Anatoli because it's clear that he didn't like him from the get-go. While Anatoli was at camp, he saw several Sherpas and none of them mentioned the possible emergency higher up on the mountain, even though they had talked to base camp about it. Anatoli then went into his tent, but he didn't just sit and drink tea as Krakauer states. He was warming up with tea, but he was also watching the south summit, which he could see from his tent and he could see the client. And at that time, he said the clouds that he saw were normal for that time of day. 45 minutes later, he was warming himself up and he realized that he might have to go back out because no climbers were coming in. And he fully admits that he didn't want to go back out there because he knew how difficult it was going to be, but he asked a Sherpa to go get him tea and 3 bottles of oxygen. He put on his pack, the 3 oxygen bottles, a mask, a regulator, and headed out to the fixed rope. No more than 15 minutes away, the storm hit. Anatoli could barely see where he was going and he could not find the fixed ropes. He looked back to camp to see people shining the flashlights for the climbers coming down. Anatoli's life was now tethered to those beams of light from camp. It would be foolish for him to go any higher, and he would die if he did. He thought that maybe some of the climbers went by him because it was now a whiteout and he may not have seen them. 30 meters from the tent, he had no energy left, and he sat to try and rest as the wind drove snow into his back. He was so exhausted he didn't know how long he sat there for, but finally he got the energy to get back up and head back to the tents, and he found it empty. Higher up the mountain, Mike arrived at the balcony with Yasuko and Beck, and Beck said she looked horrible. She was so exhausted she could barely stand. So Mike short-roped Beck and headed down with both of them. According to Krakauer's book, 500 feet above the South Col, Yasuko's oxygen ran out and she just sat down, refusing to move. Mike tried to take her oxygen mask off so she could breathe easier, but she insisted on putting it back on. He couldn't convince her that she was out of oxygen and the mask was actually suffocating her. Mike and Beck continued on. Neil and the team came across Yasuko alone. Charlotte said, "I remember getting to the top of the last fixed rope about 6 o'clock. Charlotte says that she could see that people were just stacked up on the ropes. They were collapsing and falling over and sliding into each other. She said people were helping people down as it grew darker and darker, and there was now 6 to 8 inches of new snow, and the storm was more serious than they had realized." Then there was an alarming crack and flash of thunder and lightning all above 8,000 meters. Lena describes them staggering and swimming down the mountain. Their worst fear was now materializing around them. It was sheer survival. Lena started hyperventilating from the lack of oxygen, so Clev was with her and he shared his with her. The wind was so brutal, she said that it took so much effort just to stay upright. Lopsang was helping Scott down when he kept taking off his oxygen mask, and Lopsang kept putting it back on. Lopsang said Scott was very sick, too sick to go down, and then he said he was going to jump. He was acting like a crazy man, so Lopsang short-roped himself to Scott so he wouldn't jump off the mountain. And by now, the storm was really bad. Thunder and lightning hit very close to them, and Lopsang said it was terrifying. Not long after this, Makalu and his Sherpas passed them. Meanwhile, Martin was 600 feet from Camp 4, but had been out of oxygen since the south summit. His glasses were fogging and he couldn't see any footprints. He continued down alone and was getting disoriented and wasn't sure where to go around the crevasses. In his hypoxic state, he couldn't remember the route that they took on the way up, so he just sat down for a while. And just above him was Krakauer, moving slightly ahead of Mike and Yasuko. Martin saw them and thought, "Great, I'll just go down with them." And Krakauer walked right past him. Martin got up to ask Mike where to go, and he pointed in the right direction. And this is when Martin says that he saw Krakauer sliding down on his butt in the fresh snow, so Martin did the same, trying to shave off some time. He said he flew 100 yards downhill this way. And Krakauer says he heard a deafening boom and at first thought it was an avalanche, but it was actually the thunder. As he got past the last of the fixed ropes, he now had to find his way to the tents in the storm, and that's when he ran out of oxygen. The tents were only intermittently visible throughout the whiteout, and there was no margin for error here. So he sat down to save energy, and he actually sat there for 45 minutes doing absolutely nothing. And then he recalls Andy Harris suddenly appearing out of the storm beside him, and he was slurring his words badly when he asked which way to the tents. Krakauer thought he was in serious trouble and pointed in the direction of Camp 4. He warned him that it's steeper than it looks, and the man who he thought was Andy turned away from him, sat down on his butt, and slid down the mountain on the steepest part of the incline. Krakauer thought that that's a crazy thing to do. He'll get blown off the mountain. But about 60 meters or 200 feet later, the man came to a stop, and Krakauer was sure he must have had a broken leg, but the man stood up, waved, and then stumbled over to the tents. Krakauer was kind of angry that this guy hadn't waited for him. The man Krakauer saw was actually Martin Adams. And this is his version of that interaction. Keep in mind that they're all in these huge down suits, so they don't really know who's who. But Martin said that he felt like he was moving pretty well across the South Col when he fell into a narrow crevasse. He said, I pulled myself out of that, and then the lights went out. It went dark all of a sudden. Not long after that, he fell into another crevasse, and said that that one was way worse. My right leg and arm were both in the crevasse and dangling down, and I thought, this may be it. I was afraid to move. But he had to do something because he was alone, so he swung his ice axe and smashed it into the ice above. He was then able to lift himself out of the crevasse and continue on. Falling into one crevasse is a nightmare. Falling into two in a row after summiting Mount Everest and climbing for 24 hours is a goddamn nightmare. And that's when he saw the light of a headlamp and someone just sitting there. He wondered, who is this guy? And he asked him where the camp was. Martin remembers thinking that the guy was maybe from another expedition and had wandered up from Camp 4, so he was confused when the guy said, watch out, it's steeper here than it looks. Be careful, go back to the tents and get a rope and some screws. And Martin said, I'm thinking at this point, I've almost died coming down this mountain, and this guy's been in camp all day doing nothing, gotten stuck, and now has the nerve to tell me to go down, get some rope, and come back up and solve his problem? You gotta be kidding me. So Martin looked down and didn't see anything particularly dangerous. He said you could see where it flattened out and it wasn't hazardous, so he just started walking. But he took 3 steps, tripped, and then fell on his face and slid down to the tents. He said, I got up, turned around, and waved at the guy and headed to the tents. So he didn't do it on purpose, it was actually him tripping. Lou and Tasky still hadn't made it to the tents as the storm was now raging. Visibility was down to a few feet. With no definition in the landscape, Lou quickly got vertigo, unsure with every step that he took. He wasn't sure what was below or which direction to go in. They got lucky though, and they saw some crampon prints in the snow. The blizzard was blowing so hard that it didn't stick to fill in the mark. It was like a little breadcrumb trail of crampon marks leading right to Camp 4. And they practically ran there with a burst of energy that Lou didn't know where it came from, but they were safely back at camp. So Krakauer started down the ice alone, and he finally made it to the tent. He sprawled out on his frost-covered floor of his tent, too tired to sit upright. He'd never been so exhausted in his life, but he thought, we did it, we climbed Everest. It was tense, but things turned out okay. He assumed that the others would be at camp soon. But he didn't know that 19 people were stranded by the storm and caught in a desperate struggle for their lives. Beck's right hand was really cold and he could no longer feel it, so he tried a simple fix which he would normally do anywhere, taking off his glove and putting a hand against his bare chest to warm it. But when he pulled the glove off the skin, his hand and arm instantly froze solid. Even under his 3rd expedition weight glove, he didn't even have bare hands. He had a glove on, but it froze instantly. And it shocked him so much that he lost grip on the glove and it went flying away in the wind. Neil said at the bottom of the fixed ropes, the storm intensified and things went to hell. Charlotte describes that when they got to the bottom of the last fixed lines, they could still see Camp 4 not far below. And then it disappeared. And she instantly thought of the 45 minutes they spent on the summit. Those minutes they could have used right now to get back to camp. Lena said that in this spot, many climbers lose their orientation and just walk over the edge of the mountain. Because as you'll remember, on either edge of the South Col, there's massive 1,000-foot drop-offs. So if they go the wrong way and not towards the tents, they're walking off into oblivion. At this point, there were about a dozen of them stumbling around together. There was a couple Sherpas in there too. They were walking around confused, disoriented, and nobody had a plan. Lena said it took the utmost effort just to stay upright, let alone move their feet. Clev said walking was so difficult and painful you couldn't even see your own feet. He was worried that someone would sit down or get separated from the group and they'd never see them again. So they kept staggering around blindly in the storm for 2 hours, becoming more and more exhausted and hypothermic. Everyone's oxygen had long run out, making the group more vulnerable to the wind chill, which exceeded -70 Celsius or -100 Fahrenheit. Neil said it was total chaos. People were wandering all over the place and he was yelling at them to follow a single leader. And at one point he was in front of the group and he walked over a little rise and it immediately felt like he was standing on the edge of the earth. he sensed a huge void below. The group had wandered off to the edge of the South Col with a 2,133 meter or 7,000 foot drop below. Around 8 p.m., Scott and Lopsang were still stumbling down towards the balcony when they came across Miraculous, who was now alone and too weak to keep going. And then Scott couldn't walk. Lopsang tried to carry him, but it was just impossible. Scott told Lopsang to go down, but he kept refusing. Lopsang stayed with both of them for about another hour, and that's when he started to get very cold and tired. Scott insisted that he go down and told him to send Anatoli back up. The Lopsang finally left Scott and Miraculous on a ledge 365 meters or about 1,200 feet above the South Col. Anatoli was back at the tents, alternating between trying to rest and get more energy and going out to observe the situation. He saw Martin come in and said he was a zombie, that he could barely talk and he was covered in ice. So Anatoli got him into the tent and gave him some oxygen. A Sherpa came in and had told Anatoli that he had seen some headlamps approaching camp, so Anatoli assumed people would be arriving soon. About 15 minutes later, he tried to go out again, but the wind was just so strong, much worse than earlier. And in another tent nearby, Lou was collapsed in his sleeping bag. He'd woken up to being thrown around inside the tent, and he was terrified. He said the sound was like a freight train coming at him. He was alone, disoriented, and he wasn't sure what the heck was going on. His eyes wouldn't open and they were sealed shut, so he was super confused. And then he realized that he went snowblind from that intense glare of the sunburn on his eye. So he yelled out to Beck and Andy, who he shared a tent with, but no one answered. Lou was convinced that he was gonna die. He felt helpless. He couldn't see and he was absolutely freezing. But then, in a moment he'd never forget, someone crawled inside the tent with him. He felt relieved that he wasn't going to die alone in the death zone. At 10 p.m., the lost group was at the edge of the massive drop-off into Nepal. Charlotte described coming up to the void as nothing but blackness and swirling snow. They'd stopped less than 20 meters or 65 feet from the Kangshung face. They were about 400 meters or 1,300 feet from camp. In clear weather, they could have made that trek in about 10 to 15 minutes, but they didn't even know where it was. Neil screamed at everyone to get back and get in a huddle. They hoped that the storm would subside as it had on previous nights. So they got down into a huddle and just started beating at each other on their backs and arms and legs.
We were thrashing around trying to generate some heat. You know, you'd punch on each other and do anything that tried to keep the other person stimulated and awake, because you didn't want to slide away into unconsciousness, because the odds would be you'd never wake up again.
Charlotte says that this is when her energy really began to wane. She didn't think she could make it through the night. After a while, Charlotte said they just lay together in a heap, waiting for that warm, fuzzy feeling that comes with hypothermia. Then death. Neil said he felt so close to falling asleep and never waking up. He had these rushes of warmth coming through his body and wasn't sure if it was the hypothermia or hypoxia, or both. He screamed into the wind to everyone to keep moving and kicking and trying to stay alive. Lena recalls both Sandy and Charlotte practically giving up. A little further away was Yasuko and Beck. Lena said Clev and Tim were amazing and did all the right things that night in the right way, and they took care of everybody. She said Neil tried to guide, but she sensed fear underneath his words. Lena says that she knew she wasn't going to die that night. I think she was the only one who was confident she wasn't going to die. She said, I wasn't scared, and I just knew that I'd make it through this horrible night. She could still move her toes and fingers. They were cold, but she could still feel them at least. 300 yards away, Krakauer was shivering uncontrollably in his tent as a storm tried to blow it off the mountain. Everything inside was covered with a thick layer of snow, and he drifted in and out of consciousness. At some point, Tasky came into the tent to ask him to help bang pots and to shine lights to help guide the lost climbers to camp, but Krakauer said he was too exhausted. Tasky tried to rouse others to help him, but everyone was just too exhausted. And this is something that virtually no one talks about, and this is John Tasky leaving camp for about 6 times to go look for the missing climbers. But the blizzard was too fierce for him to go very far beyond the tents. Stu Hutchinson, the Canadian doctor, he unzipped Lou's tent and asked how he was doing. He said he came to see if Lou made it back. He evaluated Lou's eyes and told Lou that his vision would improve in 24 hours or so. So that made Lou feel a lot better. He told Lou that there were big problems on the mountain, though, and that about 20 people were missing. Lou had no idea that anyone was in trouble. He was too focused on himself getting back to camp. So Stu told Lou to take it easy and that he was going to help search for the others. And Stu, how great is Stu? He just kept coming back to check on Lou. Around 11 p.m., the winds kept going, but the snow let up enough for the folks in the huddle to look up and see some stars. And then it closed in quickly again. But that was enough for Tim and Clev to know where they were. Neil wasn't sure, but Clev was absolutely positive on the direction they needed to go. Lena said Neil was really struggling to stay in control and that he was very confused and the lack of oxygen was really affecting him. She said that Clev and Neil couldn't agree on which way to go, but she was putting her bets on Clev because he was pretty confident and she trusted him throughout this whole climb. They really kind of gelled together. She said Neil seemed totally lost. And she said, I don't think Neil would have ever gotten back to camp if Clev hadn't been there. They tried to get everyone to stand up. Neil tried pulling people up and he started walking with Yasuko on his arm. Lena said Clev was steady and calm compared to everyone else who was in a barely controlled panic. Clev recalls trying to get everyone on their feet, but there were a few who couldn't even stand up, including Sandy, Charlotte, and Yasuko. Neil put an arm around Sandy, who said she couldn't walk, and he got frustrated and just screamed at her to crawl. And she did try, but every time she tried to walk, the wind knocked her over. And she crawled after that group until she lost sight of them. Yasuko was hanging on to Neil and clung to him as he started walking, but she couldn't keep up and eventually fell. Tim went over to Sandy, and he was strong and able as any of those who'd left, but he didn't want to leave Charlotte, his girlfriend. Beck thought that this took a lot of guts. He said, unspoken among us was the reasonable expectation that those left behind were dead meat. Beck really has a way with words. Charlotte remembered Beck saying as they got into the huddle, well, isn't this the darnest thing in the world, Charlotte? And she said, you got that right, Beck. Profound words when you're on the brink of death. Beck said his memory was vague from that moment on. He said he was starting to freeze, but also said it wasn't unpleasant. He started to feel warmer. Then Tim saw Beck stand up on a rock, put his arms out and say, okay, I've got this all figured out. And then the wind blew him away. And that was the last the others saw of him. The climbers had now been out for an agonizing 24 hours. As the one group stumbled back to the tents, Lena spotted a light, and it was Anatoli. She said they were all teetering on the edge of total exhaustion and only kept upright out of the excitement of arriving. Anatoli said he saw them come in and they had ice all around their faces and couldn't even see through their masks because they were so iced up. So he helped them get into their tents and sleeping bags, got them some tea and oxygen, and that's when Lena told him that Sandy's dying and maybe Charlotte too. Clev tried to give directions, and Anatoli realized that they were probably only about 15 minutes away. But it was hard to give him precise directions because they didn't know where they were. Anatoli helped Neil get his crampons off and tried to get some info about the group, but Neil couldn't say anything. He was so out of it. Anatoli was confused about where the climbers were. In the meantime, Lopsang wanted Anatoli to go up and get Scott. Anatoli was confused by the conflicting bits of information that were coming through all these climbers who were suffering from hypoxia. He asked Lopsang to help him get the clients, but Lopsang just told Anatoli to go get Scott. Anatoli realized he needed to help 5 people, but he was only one person. So he went to Rob's tents and asked for help. He said he went to 3 tents and no one answered. He then asked Rob's Sherpas to come help, but no one would go with him. The Mountain Madness Sherpas wouldn't go up to help Scott, so Anatoli had to decide whether to help Scott or these 5 clients. So he went around to Rob's tents again, and even the Taiwanese tent, and nobody answered. They were either asleep, unable, or unwilling to help. Back at the huddle, Charlotte cried and said she didn't care anymore, that she just wanted to die quickly. Charlotte said it was so painful, she just wanted it to be over. Sandy was falling apart and said her face and her hands were freezing, but that she didn't want to die. Meanwhile, Rob was still up high on the mountain with Doug. Guy Cotter, who was a former guide of Rob's, but on another expedition this year, got on the radio with Rob around midnight. He told Rob to leave Doug. Guy said that he couldn't do anything for Doug, but Rob refused to leave him. Around 1 a.m., Anatoli headed out the first time to look for the others, and there was no visibility. He looked for over 15 minutes and couldn't find anyone, so he had to go back to camp. About an hour later, he got a little bit more information from the climbers who had returned, and he headed out again. Anatoli says he again asked Sherpas and other climbers to help, but he had no luck. After Anatoli's book came out, Krakauer denied Anatoli coming to his tent to ask for help. So who knows if it happened. And Krakauer was so out of it, he may not have even heard him or remembered that he came into his tent. Charlotte says she and Sandy were slapping each other and working their arms and legs to keep working because they knew they had to be able to walk to get back to camp. As much as people say in the comments, you can't be dragged up and down Mount Everest. It's impossible, and these climbers knew it, that they had to be able to move on their own. It was at least a couple of hours of shaking and slapping and screaming into the wind that Anatoli suddenly appeared. He dropped an oxygen bottle in front of Sandy and said, "Come with me," and grabbed Charlotte. So they stumbled along until they got to the tents. It took about 45 minutes, which is normally about 15 minutes, but they made it. No one had heard from Rob for almost 3 hours. At 2:46 a.m., Guy heard a long, broken radio transmission that was probably unintentional. Rob was wearing a remote mic clipped to the shoulder strap of his backpack. It turned on by mistake, and all they heard was Rob yelling, "Keep moving, keep going," presumably urging Doug on, but no one knows for sure. But it did sound like they were still struggling at the Hillary step. This meant that it had taken them more than 10 hours to move over a section that normally took 30 minutes. Anatoli headed back out for the others around 4 a.m. This time he got to Tim and Sandy, and they got back around 4:45. Lena describes Anatoli returning and said he was just sitting there and he was absolutely empty. There was nothing left in him. Lena told him he needed to rest and needed oxygen. He said he was fine and he asked about Scott. Scott was the only one missing on their team. At 4:43 a.m., Rob spoke to base camp and he sounded disturbingly confused and irrational. He said his legs no longer worked and that he was too clumsy and weak to move. He then said, "Andy was with me last night, but he doesn't seem to be with me now." At 5 a.m., base camp patched a call through from Rob to his wife Jan, who was back in New Zealand. She was 7 months pregnant with their first child. Jan had met Rob climbing, and they'd actually climbed to the summit of Everest together in 1993, so she knew how serious a situation this was. He was slurring his words. He took some Dex and said that he was still trying to clear his oxygen mask, which had iced up. Someone asked how Doug was doing, and Rob simply said, "Doug's gone." At 6 a.m., Guy asked Rob if the sun had reached him yet, and he said yes, but that he was shaking uncontrollably. What's amazing is that Rob was still alive after a night out at 8,747 meters or 28,700 feet in hurricane-force winds with a wind chill of 100 below zero. Fahrenheit or Celsius doesn't really matter at this point. It was cold. And then Sherpas were able to head up to Rob and Scott. Several times, base camp thought Rob was starting to go down, but he never left the south summit. At 9 a.m., his Sherpas started climbing up from Camp 4 with a thermos of tea and more oxygen. It was not an easy task. Rob was 3,000 feet above them, and it was an exhausting 8-hour climb. And these Sherpas, they had just climbed the day before. They were still cold and exhausted. Shortly after them, 2 Sherpas from Mountain Madness headed up to Scott and Miraculous and tried to give Scott oxygen, but he was unresponsive and barely breathing. They felt that he was beyond any hope, and they helped Miraculous down as he was able to move on his own still amazingly. Charlotte was shocked to learn the next morning that Scott was still far up on the mountain and that Beck and Yasuko were still out in the middle of nowhere, laying near death. The storm let up enough that Stu and 3 Sherpas went in search of Yasuko and Beck. They found them lying next to each other, partially buried in snow and ice. Only their hands and feet were sticking out. Stu had to chip away a 3-inch thick sheet of ice from Yasuko's face, and he was shocked to see that she was still breathing. Her gloves were gone and her hands were frozen and her eyes were dilated. And Stu is a cardiologist, and he said he'd never seen someone so close to death and still breathing. At that moment, he didn't know what to do. He hadn't been in this situation before. He then looked at Beck, who had these ice balls the size of grapes on his hair and his eyelids. Stu realized that he was alive too, and he was mumbling, but Stu couldn't understand him. He said Beck was as close to death as a person could be and still be breathing. Stu went over to the Sherpas, who kept their distance because they don't like to be around dead bodies, and he asked them for advice. And one of them, who was an Everest veteran, said that they had to leave them there. There was nothing they could do for them. Even if they dragged them back to camp, they'd die before they could get back down. And any attempt to rescue them would risk other climbers' lives. Stu got back to camp on the verge of tears and talked with others who all agreed that the best thing to do was to leave them. And Lou said there was really no other choice than to leave them. Even Beck said, as every mountaineer knows, once you go into hypothermic coma, you never wake up. It would only end more lives to try and bring them back. Beck says he doesn't begrudge them for that decision for him, but he wonders why they didn't bring Yasuko back, because she was so small and they could have easily carried her, and she could have at least died in camp with people near her. News got down to base camp, and soon after to Beck's wife, Peach. She asked if there was any hope, and they said no, that there's been a positive body identification. Todd Burleson and Pete Athens, who were on other expeditions, they arrived at Lou's tent that afternoon to help out. They climbed up from Camp 2 to help, and Lou was super grateful for the sacrifice they were making. To climb up to Camp 4 in these conditions was unreal, he said. It meant total selflessness. Later that afternoon, Lou was concerned about how they were going to get back down. They're still in the death zone, and they have been there for quite a while, and they needed to get out of it fast. Both Lou and Krakauer mentioned the lack of leadership at this point. Rob and Andy were high up on the mountain, and Mike was the only surviving guide, but was seriously frostbitten and lying in his tent, unable to speak. Lou went to Stu's tent and said Krakauer was there, tightly pressing an oxygen mask to his face, sitting in the corner of the tent with his legs crossed and rocking back and forth. He said he didn't say a word, but his eyes spoke of the dread we all felt. About 3 p.m., Rob's Sherpas got to within 700 feet of him, but they couldn't go on because of the cold and wind. As they turned around, Rob's chances for survival vanished. Rob's friends and teammates begged him to get going down under his own power, and he said several times he was going to, but he never went anywhere. At one point he got annoyed and told everyone that if he thought he could manage ropes and knots with his frostbitten hands, he would have gone down hours ago. About 4 p.m. on May 11th, something unbelievable happened. Beck, on the verge of death, opened his eyes. He was confused and thought he was initially in bed at home, but as he started to become aware of where he was, he saw his frozen right hand in front of his face. He smashed it into the ice and it bounced like a block of wood, and that quickly brought him back to reality. He realized he was still on that damn mountain, but he had no idea where he was. He said his family appeared in his mind's eye, and he knew that if he didn't stand immediately, he'd spend eternity on the mountain. So he struggled to get up and realized both hands were completely frozen. He hadn't eaten in 3 days and hadn't had water in 2 days. He had no idea where to go, so he picked a direction and started walking. He stumbled and fell constantly, but amazingly, he found the tents. Todd Burleson was the first to see Beck and was shocked at the state of him. He said, "I couldn't believe what I saw. This man had no face. It was completely black and solid. His jacket was unzipped down to his waist, which was full of snow. His right arm was bare and frozen over his head, and we couldn't even lower it. His skin looked like marble white stone, and it looked like there was no blood left in it." So Todd got Beck into a tent and put him into sleeping bags with hot water bottles and gave him a shot of steroids. Word got down to base camp, and the response was, "It changes nothing. He's still going to die. Don't bring him back down." But Beck thought differently. He actually thought that he might be able to survive this. So once again, Beck was left alone. They left him alone in the tent and didn't even go back to check on him. He later heard others referring to the dead guy in the tent next door, and he thought, I wonder who that could be, not realizing it was himself they were referring to. And then the storm came roaring back. Beck, alone in the tent, was getting hammered by the wind and the snow. The door flew open, and the tent was pushing down on his face so much that it was almost suffocating him. This nightmare was never going to end. At around 5 p.m., after seeing Beck walk into camp, Anatoli had some hope that Scott would still be alive. He said everyone said it was stupid to go for Scott, but after seeing Beck, it gave me a push. So we got some oxygen and headed up the mountain. Around 6:20 p.m., Guy contacted Rob to let him know Jan was on the phone and wanted to talk to him. Rob put some snow in his mouth so it wouldn't be so dry, and she asked how he was doing. He said in the context of where he was reasonably comfortable. She asked how his feet were, and he said he thought he might have a bit of frostbite. And she told him that she was going to make him better when he got home. His last words to her were that he loved her, and he told her not to worry too much. And that was the last anyone heard Rob speak. Anatoli got to Scott around 7 p.m. and it was dark and storming again, but Scott was dead. The zipper of his down suit was open, one hand was without a mitten and frozen. So Anatoli collected Scott's camera, his ice axe, and his favorite pocket knife, which was then given to Scott's 9-year-old son. By the morning of May 12th, all hope was lost for Rob, Doug, and Andy. So Neil started getting Scott's team together to descend. It was hard to get everyone moving as they were in really rough shape, but he was adamant that they leave very soon. David Brashear saw them come into Camp 3 and said they looked like they'd been through a 5-month war. Sandy started to break down and they were all in total shock. Stu then got Rob's team going down the mountain. But before they left, Krakauer went into Beck's tent, who he assumed died in the night. But to his surprise, Beck was very awake and screaming at him. He was screaming for help because the wind had blown both the sleeping bags off of him, leaving him exposed in the cold wind. With his frozen hands, he was unable to bring the sleeping bag back over himself. When he saw Krakauer, he yelled, "What's a guy got to do to get a little help around here?" He'd been screaming for 3 hours, but no one heard him because of the storm. So Krakauer called the doctor at base camp and asked what they should do about Beck, and once again, the doctor said to leave him and go down with the rest of the group. Everyone was leaving Beck again and again. The name of Beck's book was Left for Dead, and it's very accurate because he was left for dead like 4 times now? Poor Beck. Krakauer says that he found Pete and Todd, and they ended up looking after Beck after the rest of them left. And eventually, Miraculous and Beck were helped down the mountain to Camp 2 and then rescued by helicopter in the highest helicopter rescue ever. When they all got back down to base camp, the remaining climbers held a memorial service for the lost climbers. And the next morning, a helicopter arrived to evacuate Charlotte and Mike, who had badly frostbitten feet. They wouldn't be able to make the hike back out. John Taskey joined them so he could treat them on the way out. Then Lou, Stu, Frank, and Krakauer hiked out of base camp. And Sandy, she also gets a lot of crap here for getting a helicopter on her own dime and only allowing a few select people access, but I don't know how true that is. Lena says that the team doctor and Tim Madsen flew out with her. Lena stayed at base camp longer than the others because she just needed time to think and grieve and have a proper goodbye for her friend Scott. And Anatoli also stayed behind, but what did he do? Well, he did a total Anatoli thing. He went on a solo ascent of Lhotse, which was next to Everest, and is the 4th highest mountain in the world. But I guess that was his way of coping. He hoped that he would find some inner clarity to what had just happened to all of them. 12 days later, the IMAX team finally made it to the summit and found Rob lying on his right side. His upper body was buried beneath a drift of snow. They didn't find any sign of Doug's body, but they did find an ice axe planted about 50 vertical feet above the south summit along a very exposed section of the ridge where the fixed ropes came to an end. It's quite possible that Rob tried to get Doug down the ropes, but at this point only to have him lose his footing and fall 7,000 feet, leaving his ice axe jammed into the ridge where he slipped. But this is all just a guess. No one really knows for sure, and no one knows what happened to Andy. Now let's look at what happened to the climbers after Everest. Well, Krakauer initially published an article in Outside Magazine in September of 1996. It was the longest piece ever published by the magazine. And then his book, Into Thin Air, followed in 1997. Anatoli and Lobsang felt attacked or blamed by the article, and they both wrote letters to Outside explaining their sides of the story, and I've linked those both below if you want to see them, because they dispute a lot of the stuff that Krakauer accuses them of. Anatoli wrote his book, The Climb. Krakauer and Anatoli kept this public feud going for quite a while. It got so heated that Krakauer showed up at a talk Anatoli was giving in Banff, Alberta, and Krakauer felt the need to stand up, go to the microphone, and call Anatoli out on his actions on Everest. He later regretted doing this and said that they made up after the talk, but who knows if that's actually true. and Anatoli died in an avalanche on December 25, 1997 on Annapurna. 3 weeks after his death, Anatoli was awarded a mountaineering award from the American Alpine Club for his rescue efforts. Lena said of him, "His presence is greatly missed. He never pampered people, but he would risk his life if you were in real trouble. He was a tender man with a philosopher's soul." Krakauer said in 2015 as the movie Everest was coming out that climbing Mount Everest was the biggest mistake I've ever made in my life. I wish I'd never gone. I suffered for years with PTSD, but if I could go back and live my life, I would have never climbed Everest. Scott's other guide, Neil, continued climbing and has given numerous public talks on his experiences on Everest. He later said Anatoli looked to him to defend his decision to leave the summit that day early, but Neil felt that he was in the wrong, so he just kind of didn't say anything about it. Neil returned to Everest in 2011 and reached the summit. Lobsang died in August of 1996 in an avalanche on Everest. He was only 25 years old and left behind a wife and a young baby. Lena said afterwards that Everest is a real and brutal place. People die up there all the time. How can you be surprised and shocked about it? She's now a speaker and an author. For years after, she didn't want to go anywhere cold. She said the memory of the marrow of my bones being deep frozen solid was so strong. It took a long time to warm up again. Charlotte and Tim eventually broke up, and there's not much out there about Tim, and Charlotte kept climbing but on smaller mountains. She said time to go to some lower peaks to climb more technical routes with a few friends. You can just as easily get killed there, but with so many mountains in this world, why not mix it up? Altitude isn't everything. Charlotte later got married to Reese Martin, who was killed in 2004 in a paragliding crash. And oddly enough, in 1993, her boyfriend Mark died in an avalanche while ice climbing in the Canadian Rockies. She said she was never mad at either of them for dying in their pursuit of living, since she very much had the same intensity of life. Her friends and family were shocked to find out how she died. She fell down some stairs at her home in Colorado in 2018. She was 61 at the time. Clev hasn't really talked much on this, but Krakauer did talk to him after Everest. Clev said he felt awful about the loss of so many lives, but he didn't have survivor's guilt. He said he used up everything he had that night trying to save himself and people around him. He had frostbitten one cornea and was practically blind. He was hypothermic, delirious, and by the time he got back to the tents, he had nothing left. Stu didn't say much post-Everest, but did say that he felt the only thing to do was just to kind of keep quiet and give the families of those who have died their space. He said there was a period of being mortified hearing what had been said out there, and he said there was a sort of subjectivity to the whole thing that was impressive. He claims that Krakauer's characterization of him as a novice climber was wrong because he had actually attempted Everest 2 years earlier. And that led to some odd encounters. He said for the next 5 years, people would come up to him and say, well, you didn't deserve to be there because you never climbed before, because that's what they'd read. And then when he tried to explain to them that, actually, I have quite a bit of experience before I went to Everest, and they said, no, you didn't. It's just like some people in the YouTube comments. Sandy received the most amount of backlash when she returned. Even Krakauer admits that she became a lightning rod for a great deal of public anger, most of which was caused by his portrayal of her. People constantly say in the comments that Sandy didn't thank those who saved her, and that's just absolutely wrong. She very publicly has said numerous times that Anatoli saved her life and that he's her hero. In a 2006 Outside article, Sandy vehemently defended Anatoli's decisions on the mountain that day and attacked the media, saying most of what was reported in 1996 was prejudiced, sensationalist, and overblown. Thrilling fiction at best, but not journalism. Sandy has stayed active and discovered CrossFit in 2012 and loved it immediately. It pulled her out of a depression she was in and gave her a renewed life. Beck was one of the most high-profile climbers after this event due to his horrible frostbite and many surgeries. He lost both of his hands and his nose, which they were able to reconstruct by growing a new nose upside down on his forehead. 4 months later, he was back at work. His climbing career ended, but he was finally able to overcome the suicidal depression he had for most of his adult life. After Everest, he said, "For the first time in my life, I have peace. I no longer seek to define myself externally through goals and achievements and material possessions. For the first time, I'm comfortable in my own skin." And one of my favorites is Lou. Lou's book was really great, and it gave a different perspective that you don't hear very often. As he was leaving Everest, he gave his Sherpa all of his climbing gear and told his wife he was done with climbing. He returned home completely traumatized from the event, like many survivors. I'm sure, this was in 1996. We didn't really have much help with mental health, and I'm sure they all had PTSD from this. Probably took decades to get over this, if they ever did. Lou became the sole caregiver for his wife after she got ill in 2010, and she passed away in 2016. They were married for 49 years. He said of the different views on the experience that each of us saw and experienced the event from different perspectives. We each sat in a different seat in the stadium of Everest. The media fell victim to the agenda-driven critics, and they locked onto an early perception of what went wrong, and have never really gotten past that. Makalu Gao ended up losing his nose, fingers, and toes. He was vilified in Krakauer's book, was portrayed as incompetent and inexperienced. But Makalu, in a Japanese documentary, shared his point of view. He put the blame solely on the Western commercial expeditions who overcrowded the mountain. He described Krakauer's account as biased and contradictory. Krakauer never interviewed him, and Makalu says the way he was portrayed and the Taiwanese team was absolutely false. 11 years later, Makalu was back on Everest, this time from the north side. The IMAX team continued on, and on May 23rd, they reached the summit at 11 a.m. 16 climbers summited that day. So what did the climbers themselves think about what happened? Well, Lena said she knew when she set out to climb Everest that it would have a price. She just didn't know how high a price it would be. She said Everest is pure, divine, deadly, and profoundly rewarding for a short while, just as life anywhere can be. It taught her a valuable lesson that she'll never, ever again expose herself to that amount of risk. She said being alive is precious. And I've made Lou's thoughts on this whole thing pretty clear throughout this whole series because he's really vocal about them and has a pretty different perspective than what we've heard. Krakauer's book became a bestseller, and many people just accepted it as fact. But Lou presents something quite different. In Krakauer, well, he thought that Rob became so adept at getting climbers of all abilities up that mountain that he got a little cocky. He said he bragged on more than one occasion that he could get almost any reasonably fit person to the summit, and his records seemed to support that. 4 years after Everest, Beck said he didn't blame anyone for what happened to him, and he says it was his decisions that took him there and his decisions that kept him there. Of the hate for Sandy, he says she's certainly not the Antichrist. She did not cause a disaster, the storm did. I understand the desire to find someone to blame in every tragedy, but the causes of deaths on Everest are mostly random events. Each individual must bear the consequences of their own actions and decisions. Charlotte said logistical problems plagued the summit teams from the start. Lines were not fixed, slower climbers created congestion, oxygen bottles were not delivered on time to the south summit, and leaving the summit late sealed the fate for many. When things go bad at altitude, they go real bad, real fast. Depleted oxygen, strength, and therefore judgment, combined with nightfall, strong winds, and hypothermia, all above 8,000 meters contributed to the number of deaths, she said. And different people experienced the same events differently. She said, it doesn't bother me that some of our Sherpas and guides didn't use oxygen. They had enough experience at altitude to know their limitations. These are exceptional people. Climbing at altitude is more physiology than attitude, and one's decision to use oxygen is only realized through experience and judgment. Charlotte said there were no heroes or villains. On our team, everyone helped out and filled in during the summit day and subsequent night to the best of their abilities. Everyone was down at some point and up at another. And so, circling back to the first question I asked in part 3, which seems like years ago now, is who's to blame? My answer to this, and your answer may be different, and that's okay, and I want to hear it in the comments either way, but is basically everyone is to blame. Individual decisions were ultimately what sealed everyone's fate. Many climbers said that you're on your own out there and you can't rely on anyone else to save you. You have to be independent and make your own decisions. And that's why some of those really experienced climbers turned back the earliest. They knew that making the summit and getting back down alive would be compromised if they kept going. Charlotte talked about the obsession to summit, and so did Lou. They said you go so far up the mountain, and you've come so far, you've spent years training for this, and there's one goal, and there's no way you're going to turn around unless things really go bad. Lena said that after the disaster, there was a lot of focus on turnaround times, but in that moment, reaching the top of the world was all that mattered. And that's what they call summit fever. It's the obsessive compulsion to summit a mountain at all costs. And there were also leadership decisions that were definitely questionable. Sending up all those people on the same night didn't make any sense to those who were there. Rob didn't stick to his turnaround times. He didn't trust Doug's own evaluation of his own health, so Doug kept climbing to his death. Scott kept deferring to Rob and ignored the wise decision of the IMAX team to turn around because of that weather window wasn't there yet. Scott didn't listen to Anatoli's advice, yet he was way more experienced in the Himalayas than Scott was. Then there's the competition between them. That was probably a factor in the decisions they made. And we could add the rope delays in here, but those were ultimately a result of leadership decisions and miscommunication. There is now pressure on Rob to get as many people to the top as possible because Rob would get a huge financial and promotional boost from the outside article. And Lou felt that everyone on the team was under greater pressure to push their personal boundaries of acceptable risk and physical limits. And lastly, the weather. The weather was very predictable, and it wasn't really out of the ordinary for storms on Everest that year. So that's it. Thanks for watching and sticking it out with me in this 3-part epic long series that I can't believe you guys are watching. And I'm super appreciative that you are not only looking forward to these, some of you are telling me you're watching them more than once, which is amazing. And I know there's a lot of information in here, and I probably missed a lot too, because there's lots to go through. It's lots of research and writing and trying to get it all straight in a nice timeline. So I hope to do that, but if I didn't, and there's mistakes here and there, let me know. And I'm loving the discussion we have in the comments. And I'm glad that at least one dog is sticking around for the rest of this story. They've stuck it out pretty well too. Let's give a hand to the dogs. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.